Section 30 of An Englishwoman in the Philippines by Mrs. Gambier Dauncey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ted Lienhart. Letter 30, Philippine Sanitation, Decoration Day. Iloilo, May 29, 1905. I know you will be glad to hear that we are having a lull in the great heat, as the rain is beginning, or at any rate the monsoon is blowing through rain steadily from the southwest, and the thermometer has gone down from 95 degrees to 90 degrees, which makes a vast difference to us, though it must still sound like great heat to you. I have just had a letter from a Manila friend who is spending the hot season at Benguet, whither the gubernatorial party and the commissioners have also fled, and where, according to the Manila papers, I see they are having gay times. Lots of bridge. She says, "We are very chilly people up here, fires every evening and hot water bottles at night. This is a lovely country, all pine woods and tree ferns, a curious mixture. We ride about here a very great deal, play cards, walk, and generally have a thoroughly quiet, lovely time. I am going to a euchre party this afternoon at a house nearby. There are to be very nice prizes, I hear. This climate is like England. You and Mr. Dauncey would like it when he can get leave. There is a sanatorium, hospital place here where you can go for $1 gold a day per head. There is also this house, but you could not live at that here. At least, I think not. I think this climate would do most people as much good as going home. It is a beautiful place, and they shortly expect a railway to run within 15 miles of it, which will make it cheaper to get here and quicker. At present, it takes 3 days from Manila. That all sounds very tantalizing to us sweltering down here, but I think we shall wait till that mythical railway is ready, for we have several times discussed the pros and cons of a health trip to Benguet, but when C went into the matter, he found that the expenses from here and back would be more than to go to England. And then, if we did go to this paradise of pine trees and hot water bottles, we should only be that much to the good, for we should be still living on the awful Philippine food. And the question is, should we get rid of that cuirass of prickly heat? Also, would the water there still give sarna, which I think they call in India, dobe itch? And these things being so, is it not better to go home? And being at home, would it not be the utmost folly ever to venture within 100 miles of a Philippine island again as long as life lasts? I feel inclined to answer my own questions by saying, American fashion, that's so. I missed my little lovebirds so much that C got me some other pets, which we hope will flourish better. 3 baby Mongeese. They are the dearest little things, so soft and gentle, and look like very fluffy weasels, with large, dark, beady eyes and long, busy, smelling-about noses. The people here call them Gato del Monte, which is, being translated, mountain cat, though the animal we call by that name is a very different creature. They are found all over the islands, I believe, and there are many in Guimaras, whence these were brought by a countryman who was going round the offices trying to sell them, with the little things nestled in his coat. So C bought them for me for a couple of pesos. They are very young and very tame, in fact, more than tame, for they run after me all over the house, and as soon as I sit down, climb up and sit on my shoulders, or curl up in my lap, and I dare say the warmth of their woolly little bodies would be grateful and comforting amongst the pines and tree ferns at Benguet. C has made them a beautiful large cage out of a packing case and some wire netting, where they spend their time asleep in a box full of cotton wool, or else clamoring to be let out, with a curious guggling, rippling cry, a sort of cross between a nightingale's jug-jug and a cab whistle. Half the ground floor of this house was let a little time ago to a rabbit warren of low-class Filipinos who keep all sorts of animals in the rooms and throw all their refuse out into the narrow alley between this and the next house. Unfortunately, this is all on the side where our bedrooms are. After a time, we got accustomed to the mysterious noises to a certain extent, though the bleating of goats remained tiresome, and the person with consumption who coughed all night still disturbed us. The natives here die like flies of consumption, and the dreadful cough, hollow cheeks, and glittering eyes are a very common feature in the landscape. Well, we weathered through the noises, though we were often inclined to shift our quarters to the other side of the house, to the rooms which that persistent American wished to inhabit. Fancy breakfasting with them. I have not got over that yet. But on that side, unfortunately, the construction of the house is such that there is no through draught, without which one cannot sleep. Finally, however, the smell of the refuse gave C an attack of tonsillitis with a touch of fever, and as I myself had also had some sore throats, we made the move across and found it was not so bad after all, for the southwest monsoon blowing straight in kept the air quite bearable. The smells on the other side got worse and worse, and we put bowls of disinfectant about and complained to the landlord of the house. He said he had no power, meaning that he was really afraid to offend and lose his tenants, but he would speak to the people, advising us at the same time to go to the sanitary inspector of the town, who would set things right. Now, the municipality consists of natives, and the sanitary inspector is a Filipino with a Filipino's notions of sanitation, so he can't see what we have to complain about, and we went on sending in complaints and protests, which met with vague replies at first, and latterly with none at all. So at last C told the landlord that if he did not have the alley cleared, we would leave the house, whereupon journals, laborers, were promptly hired, and unimaginable arrears of horrors dug out and removed. Oh, the smell! And as to future transgressions of the laws of cleanliness and decency, C has adopted his own method for that, which consists in the simple plan of leaning out of the window when the people below do anything he does not like, and calling them babuis, pigs, or sin vergüenza, without shame, in a very loud voice, which they don't like at all. And this method has more effect than anything else, for he says, you can always get at a Filipino by making him ashamed of himself. We are lucky to be no worse off, however, for it is a marvel to me how this town is not swept clean of inhabitants by some awful plague, when one thinks that it is absolutely without drainage or sanitation of any sort, and when one sees and smells the awful and ghastly rubbish heaps which fester right amongst the houses in the town. The only saving of the place is the monsoons, and it is no wonder everyone feels so ill and languid, even the natives, as soon as the wind drops. There is a costly school of tropical medicine in Manila, and many learned articles appear in the papers from time to time about germs and bacilli, and so on, assuring us that when the Filipinos know more mathematics and Latin, they will know how to live more healthily. But sound common sense would seem to lie in the direction of a strong and efficient sanitary control of white experts and a few schoolma'ams replaced by some paved and drained streets. Oh, the streets! They are a disgrace to civilization, for I have never, no, not in Morocco, not in little towns in the Canaries, known such neglect, such dirt, such squalor, and such smells. Grass grows at the sides of the streets, and in wet weather many stagnant pools appear on pieces of waste ground and between the houses, looking very pretty indeed amongst the brilliant greenery when the sun comes out again, with beautiful reflections mirrored in their shallow depths and making little gems of scenes like bits out of a fairy pantomime. All the same, one could quite willingly sacrifice their beauty in the cause of health and for the sake of matter-of-fact drainage. Mosquitoes breed in the swampy places in which the native houses generally stand, and at night the inhabitants frequently light fires under their flimsy dwellings to dry the ground and destroy the insects. At first sight, these fires look very strange and alarming. We often pass them as we drive in the evenings, and it is yet another of the local miracles to see the dry thatch huts not taking fire from a pile of leaves and grass burning underneath. In connection with the swamps, too, or I suppose so, the Filipinos have another curious custom, which is, as soon as anyone is taken ill, to shut the house up tightly, with the screens let down and fastened over the openings that serve as doors and windows, and whenever you pass a house all dark and hermetically sealed, with tiny slits of light here and there, you know some unfortunate soul is ill inside, and in all probability dying, for the Filipinos have no physique, and if they get seriously ill, they snuff out like a taper. When a poor person is dying, really at the point of death, he or she is taken out of bed and carried to the priest to be assoiled, which generally has the effect of killing the invalid outright. Only 2 evenings ago we met one of these melancholy little groups going along the Harrow Road, 2 of the men carrying a long bamboo pole on their shoulders with a canvas hammock slung to it, and I think the poor woman, whose head was lolling out, was dead already. An American hospital, to which we have all contributed by request, is being provided for the town, and when we drive out, we often pass down the road where this remarkable building is rising slowly from a pile of beams and planks, all stacked ready and cut to certain lengths. I say it is remarkable because the hospital has apparently been designed in America by someone who has never heard of the Philippines, for the main supports, the ariges, instead of being made of great trees of hardwoods, are quite slender posts of Oregon pine, and the cross beams, and in fact all the timber work, are of the same wood, which is about as much good as so many pieces of cardboard against insects, typhoons, earthquakes, and so forth. I dare say these plagues do not prevail in the country where this fantastic building was evolved. But if the substructure of the hospital was the laughing-stock of the town, and the subject of many rather acid jests on the part of those who had contributed to such a monument of folly, you can imagine what was thought and said when the wards were seen in the making and observed to consist of screens of nipa and bahuco matting. All so hasty, so shoddy, such a piece of blatant jobbery, but to hear its advocates talk, you would think the finest hospital in Europe was being rendered silly and out of date. Tomorrow is Decoration Day, the anniversary of the close of the War of the North and South, when the graves of the soldiers who fell in that struggle are decorated in the United States. Out here, the day has also been established as a public holiday, observed with bands and processions, and they have so ordered the ceremony that the graves of those who fell out here in the war with Spain and the insurrection are supposed to be decorated, Americans and Filipinos alike. But the 2 events become hopelessly confused in the native mind, and it is no wonder that the Filipinos have some dim idea that they are rejoicing over the fall of those of the Americans whom they managed to kill in the insurrection. There are not many American soldiers' graves out here to decorate, however, as the dead American warriors are being dug up everywhere and sent back to their homes. Such a queer idea. Fancy if we dug up all the men who fell in our innumerable wars and sent them to their relations at home. There is nothing left but bones, of course, but each man is identified by a bottle containing his name, etc., which was buried with him. At least they are identified to a certain extent, but a man who had the job of bringing a lot of these defunct warriors down the Pasig for shipment told C that the only thing to be done, as a rule, was to put a name on a coffin and then lay inside as many bones as you could find to make a complete skeleton. It sounds rather horrible, but I must say one can't have much sympathy with such unheroic and superstitious sentimentality, which seems to me no better than the customs of the Chinese. End of section 30. Section 31 of An Englishwoman in the Philippines by Mrs. Gambier Dauncey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ted Lienhart. Letter 31. Mr. Taft, Tropical Sunsets, Unpleasant Neighbors, Filipino Law. Iloilo, June 5, 1905. I don't think I have yet mentioned to you the great excitement in Manila and in the Philippines generally, which are convulsed by the wind of the coming of Mr. Taft, the Secretary of War in the USA, who, as I told you before, used to be governor out here. He is returning now to the Philippines on a sort of tour of instruction for the benefit of a party of senators who, so say the papers, have been opposed to Philippine interests at Washington, owing to these interests clashing with their own sugar plantations, mines, and tobacco industries. Everyone seems to think this expedition a very good idea, and it is going to be gay and social as well, for a good many ladies, wives, and other relations of the senators are to be included, and they say that the president's daughter, Miss Alice Roosevelt, may come too. Some say that she will come for the trip as a pleasure party, and others declare that she is only to be sent as a pawn and symbol of the president's goodwill towards Mr. Taft and his schemes. In the meantime, the papers are full of personal descriptions and puffs preliminary of the members of this party, but by far the most popular figure seems to be that of the president's daughter, about whom we get columns of description and narrative. She must be a very fascinating and charming and lovely girl, for though she is only 20, she has refused numberless offers of marriage from all sorts and conditions of men, including the effete hand of Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, he to whom our Princess Margaret of Connaught is now engaged. About this latter affair there is a very long account copied from another American paper, I mean a USA one, not a Manila paper, where it is said that Miss Roosevelt had declined to be a princess because she will not marry a man she does not love. I think that is highly creditable to her, don't you? And such a fine example to some of her countrywomen. This last week has been sunny every morning, and then clouded over in the afternoon, and generally there is rain towards evening, so we cannot make up our minds about our second trip to Nagaba, which has been on the tapis for some time. We were going last week, but put it off for various reasons till tomorrow. Now, however, the weather looks so threatening that I doubt if we shall go at all. We are not without compensations, though, as the cool-looking gray skies are delicious, and the nights almost cold, so that a sheet is necessary, and sometimes even a blanket. In spite of the lowness of the temperature, however, I do not feel refreshed, as I had hoped to do, for the southwest wind is very enervating and relaxing, and everyone really feels more languid than in the heat. This wind has unshipped our green sunblinds, as it comes in great gusts, roaring and tossing in the thick belt of high palms that fringes the beach in the distance. The sound of the surf and the wind in the palms is delightful to me, for it reminds me of the pine woods at home. A few evenings ago we got into some real country by leaving the trap on the Molo Road and walking along a path that led away through some tall brakes of bamboo. These clumps of bamboo are very graceful and beautiful, and the outline of their tapering stems and little flat leaves against the sunset skies always reminds me of that embroidered Japanese screen we have at home, by which you are perhaps sitting as you read this. We passed the bamboos and bushes by the roadside and came at once to big grass fields and palm groves, with ramshackle huts dotted about and half-clad natives. How well I can sympathize with their prompt abandonment of the unnecessary extras of the civilized wardrobe, and only wish it were our fate out here to be able to wear one garment in a palm grove. We wandered about there for a long time, up and down paths and tracks, and enjoying wonderful glimpses of glades and green vistas that were like impossible fairylands. There was the pink and orange bloom of a fine sunset, too, to add to the unearthly beauty of the palm groves, where we lingered a long time, just admiring everything in sight and smelling the delicious freshness of the wet earth. We are very anxious to go there some day and try to get a few snapshots as a reminder of the scenes, though nothing could reproduce the color. It is difficult to get enough light, as C is very busy just now and does not get home before 6. 8 to 12 and 2 to 6, good long hours for office work in the tropics. Still, we manage sometimes to get out before the daylight is quite gone, as the days are getting longer, but then it is, of course, too late to take the camera. That, by the by, is another illusion dispelled, for I am sure I have always read and heard that the sun in these latitudes sinks suddenly at the same moment all the year round. I have already told you that I have watched in vain for this phenomenon. I don't know what happens in other places, but since the sun has come north here, the sunset has gradually changed to quite half an hour later than it was in December. In fact, it may be even later than that, for I can read on the balcony for a long time after tea before the light fades. Of course, the twilight is brief compared to the length of time it lingers on at home, and I suppose it is sudden if it is compared to a long summer evening in England, but then you can think of our longest twilight as a flash if you compare it with Greenland. About a month ago, the basement of the empty house next door was taken by a typical Eurasian family. Such a crew. Beginning with an old father who goes about in a vest, slack, dirty trousers, and blue socks. An old mother, vastly fat in petticoat, chemise, and slippers, some sons and daughters of all ages, and their husbands and wives and children, and 2 native servants. The basement they occupy consists of 3 large rooms. From our side windows, we look right down into their windows and get many astounding glimpses of their vie intime, including fearful revelations of déshabillé, which are the delight of sea's life. This family, who are quite well known in Iloilo, Filipino, and Mestizo society, and turn out great swells at the band, sleep about on patates, mats, on the floor, in native fashion, and some of their notions of sanitation are indescribable. The old father has a fearful voice, a loud, not human bellow of insanity, which echoes in our rooms sometimes and quite frightens me, and C says I should be still more alarmed if I could understand the awful expressions he is using. They are always having horrid rows amongst themselves, all in slatternly rags in their filthy rooms. In the streets they are well-dressed and well-behaved, in true Eurasian fashion, all the world over. The sons are in various employments, which would keep the whole family in comfort, if not in decency, but one need hardly say that it all goes in Monty and buying diamond rings. About a week ago, just as we had finished breakfast, there was a terrible hullabaloo coming from the dovecote next door, and we said to each other that they must be having a worse row than usual, when we heard yells and loud voices, and the old man bellowing out even worse words than the awful things he shouts out when he wants salt or a cigarette or a sock. We rushed to the side of the house looking on their windows, but a hand was pulling the shutters together, and the screams and yells and oaths were terrible. So we ran out onto the balcony in time to see one of the sons-in-law shoot out of the house as from a cannon, yelling, "Policia, policia," and go running up the street to the police station at the corner. A crowd began to collect at once in the street, while heads appeared at every window, and the pandemonium in the house became deafening. Then suddenly a young woman in 2 garments ran out sobbing, with her hair down, followed a minute later by the fat old woman in her chemise and petticoat, wringing her hands and moaning, and running up and down, till someone caught hold of her and led her away to a house up the street. Then Juanita, the little native servant, with her hair streaming, rushed out with a baby in her arms, and the little girl of 6 came running into the people below us, terrified and white and blubbering. Then another daughter, with a white, handsome face like a Bouguereau Madonna, hurried out, and after her a woman carrying clothes, whereupon a polite native clerk stepped across from an office and conducted her to the shelter of a friendly house. All this time the bellowing and voices in the house went on undiminished, till the son-in-law arrived with a trim blue linen-clad native policeman. They went into the house together and shut the shutters and closed the door, and the noise died down, and the crowd outside melted away. Nothing more happened all that day, and no human eye saw the policeman come out again. But next day we noticed that the old man was living with the natives under us, and C made some inquiries, whereupon they said, "The old man is mad," adding quite casually that he stuck a knife into someone, so his family chucked him out. Well, so he lived there for a few days, with the windows of the house next door all shuttered so that he should not be able to see in, and every now and then he roared out, "Ramon y Juanita," or "Juanita y Ramon," always the names of both servants, when the 2 natives would go trembling to him, with the children for him to play with. This went on till yesterday, when there was an afternoon of shouting and cursing and futile advice, and the street blocked with caribou carts, and natives swarming in and out of the house, carrying furniture upside down, and trying to force it into the carts, broadside on. We hear the reason and result of all this is that the old man has moved. Some say to Manila, others to the next street. I think the poor trembling old fat wife must have gone too, as I have not seen her about again since then. The house next door has its windows open on this side again, and there seem to be more people than ever lying about there. They never do anything, and Juanita still takes the babies out in a large wicker washing basket mounted on squeaking wheels, and the young men and women look great swells at the bandstand on Sundays and Thursdays. I mentioned the way these people slept on the floor. That is a curious Filipino habit, but I dare say it is very nice and cool, and the floor can't be any harder than the Filipino bed. The servants sleep about on mats, generally in the hall of the house, but ours refuse to sleep in this house, as they say it is haunted by the spirit of a young Spaniard who died here when it was occupied by the Spanish consulate. So they spread their mats on the azotea, and if I wake up thirsty and go out into the hall for a glass of water, I see them through the open door, lying asleep on their mats in the moonlight, looking like pictures of the corpse on the battlefield out of the graphic, and rather weird and uncanny, with their clothes very white in the moonlight, and their dark hands and faces and dark bare feet. But on damp or cold, or what we call cold, nights, they look still more uncanny, rolled in blankets and looking like mummies. A friend who was here the other day told me an amusing instance of Filipino methods which happened a few days ago. A policeman came for his cook one morning with a summons on the part of the cook's wife for assaulting her. So off the cook went to the court, not the high courts where American dignity administers the highest justice with his boots off and his feet with holes in his socks on a table before him, but the police court where a Filipino tries to deal with small offenses. In the evening, our friend noticed that his own cook and not a substitute was in the house, so he asked the man what had happened in the morning. "Oh," said the cook, "they fined me $5 and my wife $5 too, and sent us away." "But," said Mr. Blank, "you beat her." "No one said I did not beat her, but they fined us both, you see, so I was allowed to go away again, free, in time to cook the señor's dinner." And you may think that sounds like a sentence out of The Hunting of the Snark, but it is perfectly clear logic to the Filipino mind, and all parties seem to think the most lucid and satisfying law had been administered. End of section 31. Section 32 of An Englishwoman in the Philippines by Mrs. Gambier Dauncey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ted Lienhart. Letter 32. Our Mongeese, a Fire, the Native Education Question. June 15, 1905. You must forgive the writing of this letter being rather bad, as I am ill in bed again, and likely to remain there for some time, for I have developed a tiresome complaint which takes, so people tell me, a long time to heal. It sounds very simple, for what has happened is that the mosquito bites with which my feet are covered have become poisoned with something in the water or the touch of a fly, and I hobbled about for a long time in great pain, being doctored and told to lie up, but I would not consent to, as it is so dull, and the warmth of lying even on a mat makes one's prickly heat unendurable. Now, however, I am forced to give in, for I can't walk across a room. An American friend tells me she has had this malady, and it extended all the way up her limbs, and she suffered great pain and was ill for months. I am afraid this does not console me much, for I am a bad patient, as I have never had anything the matter with me before I came out here. The climate is certainly trying, but some people who seem to be able to weather through it pretty well, though I have never met anyone who is really what one would call robust. Some become wrecks, as I apparently should do if I stayed much longer. I can't tell you how thankful I am to think that there is a chance of going home. Our dear little mongeese are flourishing. We let them out of the cage nearly all day now, and they go running and smelling about the house, squeaking when they think they are lost, and then I have to go and find them when they crawl up me as up a large tree and go to sleep on the branches, quite safe and happy. I think you would love them. They have the sweetest little innocent faces I ever saw, and such pluck and individuality, each with its own little fads and manners. In India, I believe, people keep mongeese to kill snakes, but here they seem to be ready to pursue any and everything, and the house evidently affords good hunting, especially the space under the roof. I saw one of the mongeese under my wardrobe the other day, struggling with what looked like some dreadful gray insides of a little animal, and I hauled her out, thinking she had got hold of something that might poison her. It was the mangled body of a house lizard, horrible sight. Then another of the little creatures caught an immense spider yesterday and sat under the salad table tearing off the long hairy legs and then choking the body down in great gulps. Ugh. One night last week I was awakened by a police whistle in the street, sounding an alarm, which is one long note and two short ones. We found this alarm note out in a rather curious fashion, as one evening we whistled for one of the servants like that. We were sitting on the balcony at the time, and a few moments later a policeman knocked at the door and wanted to know what murder or other trouble we were in. And when C inquired about it at the police station, they asked him not to blow a whistle in that way in the street again unless we were in danger. It was a comfort to know that the signal would work so well. So when we heard the long note and two short ones in the night, we turned out onto the balcony, whence we saw the glow of a big fire at the end of the street towards the point, and Filipino policemen were running along below with clanking buckets. The building that was on fire was the military corral, stables, which made a fine blaze, and there was a stirring scene when the poor frightened horses came tearing down the quiet, dark street in a maddened rout. They were the American horses, which looked so big and powerful and quite alarming to eyes accustomed to the little Filipino ponies. They clattered down the street in batches, tossing their heads and trying to pass one another with the glow of the fire in the sky behind them, and we heard the sound of their hoofs dying away and away through the empty town. After a while the light in the sky faded out. The policemen with their buckets returned slowly, and we went back to bed. But no one else in the street had so much as looked out of a window. We learned afterwards that many of the horses were found wandering far out in the country, but I believe some of them have not been caught even yet. The corral was burnt to the ground, as they had to wait till the police arrived to put it out, because there were only 2 soldiers sleeping there, all the rest living in houses in the town and suburbs with their queridas, native mistresses. This seems a very strange state of affairs, but it is a well-known fact, and on this particular occasion was referred to quite casually by the soldier on duty, of whom C was asking information, and who apparently thought it was the most natural arrangement for troops in a disaffected country. I have been reading a great deal since I have taken to bed, and besides all the home papers you send me, I have the Manila papers in El Tiempo, Iloilo, which I find I can read quite easily now. The Manila Times of June 10 had a long article about the eternal education question, headed Arbitrary Race Distinctions, in which, as you may gather from the title, some American works out his nation's theory that there is no real difference between East and West. The writer very amiably wishes to point out that Filipino children are just as intelligent at school as our American children, and I think this is about the 100th article I have read to that effect. But I have still to read or hear any observation to the effect that precocity is the natural heritage of every Oriental child. Americans always appear to judge the Philippines by no standard, precedent, or parallel, which I suppose is very natural for anyone coming straight from such an absolutely different country as the USA. In this article, of which I am speaking at present, there are many long and fine words recklessly thrown about, such as introspection, collective individuality, and so forth, which I think are meant to prove that if a Filipino child is precocious, he will grow up a clever, cultured, and enlightened man or woman, whereas every unprejudiced person knows that the Filipino people learn with intelligence, an intelligence which is, after all, only remarkable when compared to a very ordinary white child, till they reach manhood or womanhood, and then it is as though a veil were drawn over the brightness of their minds, and they not only progress no further, but even go backwards. This optimist also pictures a future in 3 generations when the iron horse will spin merrily up and down the passes, by which, I take it, he implies that means of communication will at last, instead of at first, be established, and after a lot of hyperbolical descriptions of machinery, he winds up with this, quote, "A sleek, well-nourished Filipino will garner the grain and check the tree bowls," end quote, which is very fine talk, but to begin with, no one ever saw a Filipino who was not sleek and well-nourished, and what one wants to know is what laborers will toil at the iron horse and the machinery with sufficient thrift and honesty to make those concerns worth the attention of the American or even Filipino capitalist. It is easy to imagine that someday the natives of the Philippines may be allowed to administer their own government and deal out laws of life and death to each other. But where is capital to come from? For the notion of Wall Street putting money into a business run by a Filipino would be beyond the wildest dreams of the most uninstructed voter in the remotest state. Now, what I can't make out is this. Are all these essays and writings and leaders about the absolute equality of the Filipino mind with the best white intellect really genuinely what the Americans think of these people? Or are they just so much dust in the eyes of the native as well as the foreign critic to excuse and justify the position the USA has chosen to assume towards these islands? End of section 32. Section 33 of An Englishwoman in the Philippines by Mrs. Gambier Dauncey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ted Lienhart. Letter 33. A paper chase, lack of sports, preparations for Mr. Taft. Iloilo, June 26, 1905. C and another man got up a paper chase last Sunday, and by way of being cordial, advertised the event in El Tiempo a day or two before, C and his friend arranging to be the hares, and let all Iloilo chase them if it cared to. They were very keen and excited about their venture, which was something quite new in the way of local enterprise. The meet was in Plaza Libertad at 6 a.m, and when they got there and found a large company of Spaniards, mestizos, Swiss, and one or two other Englishmen, they were delighted and set off in great feather. Our pony is a very good goer and can fly along ahead of almost any other pony here. So C and his friend started and tore along the Haro Road in the cool morning, with the field after them. Beyond Haro, where they were out in the open country, they noticed that the hunt was far out of sight and hearing, so they ambushed in some bamboo brake and hung about, peeping round bushes for about a quarter of an hour, and then went cautiously back a few yards and hung about again, and so on till by degrees they got back into Haro. Imagine their disgust when they at last tracked the other sportsmen to a bar where they were sitting at little tables drinking cold beer. Their fury about the incident is comical, but one cannot help sympathizing with them after all the trouble they took to infuse a little sport into the place. One of the chief things Cebu crows about is possessing a race course and a jockey club, and I think they are quite right so to crow, as something of the sort would be a boon here. One need hardly say that when anything like that is done in Manila or anywhere else, the Americans have no part in the initiative, as they are not a very sporting people, and all they do to keep themselves alive is baseball. It seems so odd to be in a garrison town and not see officers with sports or a club or polo or gymkhanas or anything. The Filipinos have no games, and the great idea is to teach them baseball, which, by the by, the Americans call ball game. When I say the Filipinos have no games, I forget a sort of ball they throw about in the streets or anywhere, made of strips of bamboo bent into a hollow spherical frame. But the throwing about is not conducted on any principle or according to any rules. When I am feeling well again, I should like to ride in the mornings, but I wish I had brought my saddle, as there is not such a thing as a side saddle to be bought in Iloilo, or the shopkeepers tell us, in the whole islands. This is because the mestizas never ride at all, and the American women ride astride in large, loose trousers that look like two skirts. Note, this breach of Oriental decorum is one of the most fatal and irreparable mistakes the Americans have made in the Philippines. It is a subject on which the Filipino or mestizo is not slow to speak his mind. Alas for misunderstandings. End note. There are very few here who ride, but I saw several going about in Manila, and am confirmed once and forever to my allegiance to the side saddle, for a more hideous and ungainly effect than women astride I never saw, to say nothing of its vulgarity. The attitude also brings out all the disproportions of the female figure, making it look top-heavy and ill-balanced. It is all very well for the Amazons to look well on a Greek sarcophagus, but no modern woman of over 16 is shaped like that, and I very much doubt if the ordinary ancients were either, quite apart from corsets, boots, and collars. Besides all that, from the point of view of sense, a woman's knees can't be strong enough to grip the saddle. So as I have not brought my own saddle, I shall not be able to ride, and now we are thinking of going home. It is not worth while to send for it. I read in my Manila papers that there is a fearful row going on in Manila now, because the committee who are arranging the banquets and receptions for Mr. Taft and his party have invited heads of every religious sect except the Iglesia Filipina, and the latter are making a terrible fuss and insisting on Father Aglipe being included amongst the official guests. Of course, if he is asked, the RC won't come, and the Pope will be furious, and the insurrectionist party will score one important point in the public eye. On the other hand, if the authorities fall out with Aglipe, they fall foul of his powerful following, who give quite enough trouble as it is, so they are in a very uncomfortable cleft stick, besides the fact of partisanship for any one religion being entirely unconstitutional. And the trouble is aggravated, you see, by Mr. Taft being such an ardent pro-Filipino, and all the natives believing that his advent is to be a sort of second coming to announce the millennium of freedom. What he is coming for, besides the personal conducting of the anti-Filipino senators, is a staple subject of conversation, many thinking he will be allowed to announce a great reduction in taxation as a sort of halo to his visit. Whatever it is, I am so anxious not to miss his visit, and I do hope our return journey will not have to begin before he and his party arrive. Besides the Taft excitement, Manila has been convulsed for months by efforts to get fireworks from America for the 4th. Already in the month of April, there were huge scareheads, as they call them, in the papers, with letters big enough for a poster beginning, "Fireworks not gone off yet," and then another headline to the effect that they will not reach Manila till June. Sometimes these headlines are very comical. Whether intentionally or not, I don't know. For instance, when the transport Sherman left, there was a headline in enormous letters, "Sherman's Living Freight," which I at first took to mean cows or horses, but found to my surprise it was only a list of officers' names. I am sure you will be sorry to hear that one of our dear little Mongeese is dead, the little man of the party. He was very sick for a day or two, lying on the floor on his stomach as if in pain, and when the others came running into my room in the morning, he could only crawl very slowly after them. At last, at about 10 in the morning, he died, poor gentle little beast, and I made Domingo take him out and bury him in the garden. We don't know what he died of, but we think it was tough cockroach, as his poor little throat was full of hard brown wings, which we hauled out, but it did him no good to get rid of them. What I fear is he may have picked up a cockroach which had died of rat poison. I gave him weak sherry and water to revive him, but he brought it all up again with pitiful little groans and squeaks, and soon afterwards he died. The little widows did not seem to mind much. They hopped about as usual, but now one of them has injured an eye in some way, and has gone blind in it, and is very sick and sorry, and I am afraid she won't live long either. I bathed the poor eye with cold tea, which gave the little creature some relief, for she lifted the lid slowly, and then I saw that the eye had a cut right across, as if some animal had scratched it. She can only move very slowly, with her head on one side, a very sad sight, just able to crawl as far as wherever I am, and then sit in a heap waiting to be lifted up, when she goes to sleep on my lap and lies still for hours. End of section 33. Section 34 of An Englishwoman in the Philippines by Mrs. Gambier Dauncey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ted Lienhart. Letter 34. Trying Heat. An American Prospector. New Lodgers. Bargaining for Pina. Iloilo, June 29, 1905. The weather is becoming more stormy, and typhoons are signaled, but so far they seem to go wide of us, which is a very good thing. The thermometer the last few days has been very low, 78 to 80 degrees, but the damp makes it more trying and relaxing than when we had over 90 degrees to contend against. With the rain, all sorts of trees have come into bloom, things with coarse, strong foliage and huge, bright flowers. The fields are all covered with very vivid green grass and corn coming up, and sometimes when there is a purple thundercloud across half the sky and all these colors in the sun, wet with rain, shining against it, the effect is simply like a scene cut out of glittering metals. As I explained to you when we first arrived, life here is adapted to dry heat, and the fears I had then about the wet season are being justified every day. For steel and silver rust while you look at them. Clothes come out in feverish patches of blue mold. Satin and silk go so that they tear like tissue paper. And all sorts of mysterious beasts are stowed away in our garments, while shoes have to be shaken before putting on more carefully than ever. C amused me the other day with an account of an American millionaire who came down by the last boat from Manila to prospect in this island in Negros for sugar. It seems that the fancy of this plutocrat, who is quite a common, roughly dressed old man, is to buy up half the island, with which object he went to the office, as C's firm are the largest, if not the only, exporters of sugar in these islands. C said the old chap's notions filled everyone with amusement, for he wants to get control of some plantations and put up sugar mills that will crush 10,000 tons of cane daily. The price and scarcity of labor were represented to him as a factor in his schemes, as well as the export tax, lack of roads, and other trifles. But he was not much depressed, and I dare say he will tackle the enterprise in the American sink-or-swim style, which seems rather a pity, as what the Philippines want is small and prosperous farms, not huge trust-like businesses to produce vast sums to be spent in New York or Paris. You remember my telling you about the fracas next door? That family all moved away eventually, but not to Manila, only to the next street parallel to this. The next-door basement is now occupied by a dressmaker, a jolly, fat, old Tagalog woman with a deep voice like a man, and her hair scraped up into a knob with a comb, an ordinary white bone one for combing, stuck across it. Besides the comb, she wears nothing but a chemise, petticoat, and slippers. The work girls are all natives, and they sit about the big front room on mats on the floor, sewing and cutting out and talking all day long. They are there at 5 in the morning and often work till after dark. 2 have sewing machines on tables, and they look so queer in their tight native sarong and muslin camisa, sitting on a Viennese cane chair at a treadle machine. The husband of the Tagalog is a fat, greasy Spaniard with side whiskers and an eternal cigar, who lounges all day in a cane chair and vest and trousers, reading the Heraldo and balancing his slippers on the tips of his bare toes. They appear to hit it off very well, he and his old native wife, for he is quite content to blouse and loaf all day and roll off to his club now and then, while she is a typical, thrifty, hard-working Tagalog, always amongst her work girls, and generally sewing herself. Note: the Tagalogs are a much more industrious race than the Visayans, and are always in demand as clerks, workmen, or servants, in preference to the Southerners. End note. She sits in a chair, though, and every now and then picks up an old cigar box that is forever within her reach, and rolls herself a cigarette, scooping up very carefully every crumb of tobacco that falls into her capacious lap. This Filipina keeps the house much cleaner than the mestizas did, and has more regard for privacy in the shape of curtains of bright cretonne nailed across the side windows. The old lady has a very pet dog, which is exactly like herself, a huge, fat, sleek, brown creature, perfectly good-natured, with a deep, full voice. They have a spaniel, too, and other dogs that run in and out, and I can't make out how many belong to the house, or how many are only friends, but I got to be quite certain of one, which nearly always lies on the window ledge, and to know it by sight. After a time, however, it gradually dawned on me that this particular spaniel never moved, and then I discovered that he was stuffed. Till I knew that, he was, to me, a quiet, contemplative dog, but since I found he was stuffed, he has become a horrible, uncanny demon. Yesterday morning, a little old native woman appeared wandering round the balcony with a bundle under her arm. When she caught sight of me, she darted away, and in a few minutes Sotero came into the sala saying that a mujer, a woman, wanted to sell some piña to the señora. I said I did not want piña particularly, but that the woman could come and show it to me if she liked. So in she came and squatted on her heels in the doorway while she undid the bundle. First a piece of cotton, and then an old newspaper, then more cotton, and at last a lot of rolls of muslin. They were very pretty pieces of stuff, dyed in pale greens, pinks, blues, and mauves, but she wanted 16 or 18 pesos apiece, 32 to 38 shillings for them, dress lengths of 15 narrow yards. I said, I will give you 9 pesos. Santa Maria, she threw up her hands. I could not live. My mistress would beat me. I said that was nonsense because she knew no Filipino lady would dream of giving her more than 7. 14 at the very lowest, senora, and the American ladies gave me 18 without any questions. That is very silly of them, I said, but I knew it to be true, for I had been present at a great buying of piña by American tourists, and the prices they gave were simply idiotic. I am not Americana, I said. I know that. I dare say she did, for on that point a native rarely, if ever, makes a mistake. So I would not think of asking the señora more than 13, which I hope she will not mention to anyone. Why should I pay 13 for stuff that I know is to be had in the Filipino houses for 9? If I say 12, may the señora say a prayer that I may not be dismissed by my mistress? I am Protestante. I think each person must say their own prayers. The señora is wise and good. She will give me 11.5, and so on and so on. Before we had done, I was the kindest, wisest, most humane and beautiful and polite woman the sun ever shone on. I was blessed by all the saints in turn. But I paid 9 pesos for a roll of blue piña, and the old woman said she would come any day and sell me any amount more at the same price. End of section 34. Section 35 of An Englishwoman in the Philippines by Mrs. Gambier Dauncey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ted Lienhart. Letter 35, Declaration Day, the Cult of the Flag, a procession, festivities, and a ball. Iloilo, July 4. This is a tremendous day here and a universal public holiday. Declaration Day, you know, the anniversary of the day when the states declared themselves independent of the mother country. All the town is gay with palm branches and myriads of stars and stripes, while the fun began at sunrise this morning by a great letting off of Chinese crackers and Americans coming out on their balconies in pajamas and firing pistols into the air. I think the Americans must be a very patriotic people, for out here they keep up these anniversaries with even more fervor, I am told, than they do at home, where they are a tradition of the soil. The cult of the national flag, too, is a perfect passion with them, and I have yet to see an American house out here where the stars and stripes do not appear in some part or other. In very many houses, the flag is used as window curtains, as ceiling draperies, as portieres, as tablecloths, besides little extra sort of Christmas cake flags being stuck about wherever an ornament is wanted. One does not see this sort of thing in colonies of other countries, but the American flag devotion is really so sincere that one cannot cavil at its excess. Nevertheless, we should consider it odd if the houses of high officials, and of everyone, in fact, in one of our colonies were decorated with Union Jacks in this fashion. Of course, the Spaniards laugh at it very much, but then they are, very naturally, rather critical of all things American. One of them was holding forth bitterly to me on this flag question a day or two ago, and when I said that I thought it very nice to see so much patriotic feeling, he waved his hands and replied very hotly, "It is not patriotism, it is farce. We who have been born and bred for hundreds of generations in our native soil and love our country as a mother, we hold our flag sacred. We do not use it as furniture." I was much amused at his vehemence, but did not dare to smile for fear of hurting his feelings. Instead, I tried to soothe him down by saying that I thought the flag cult was perhaps a benefit as a direct appeal to the elementary natures of the Filipinos. This move of mine was a failure, however, for he burst out with renewed fury. "The Filipinos, what they think of it, ha! You should hear them," so I gave him up as a bad job. To get back to the Declaration Day, the popping of pistols and throwing of crackers into the streets went on intermittently till about 8 o'clock, when a procession began marching about the town, and luckily the day is extremely fine, though it is very hot indeed, as, though the thermometer is as low as 84 degrees, there is not a breath of wind stirring, and all nature is very still and bright and shining. The procession began to pass our house at about 9, so we had no more trouble to see it than just to lean over the balcony with some friends who had come round to profit by our position. C tried to get some snapshots, but I am afraid they may not come out very well, as the camera is damp, like everything else in the house, and has a good coating of the prevailing blue mold. The first spectacle that came along was a number of American officers on horseback, in khaki, with sashes of any color they seemed to fancy, pale blue, pink, scarlet, slung round one shoulder and tied in a large bow on the hip. They rode the big army horses, which are no larger than ordinary horses at home, but as I told you before, they look like pantomime animals after one's eye is used to the Filipino ponies. There was some hitch out of sight as the procession reached us, and all the officers pulled up their horses and turned round to look back. I don't know what it was, but they halted a long time, trying all the time to get into the shade of the houses, for the heat was already very great. The men's khaki suits were dark with perspiration, quite a different color. Their horses dripped puddles of sweat when they halted, and one white horse was gradually turning purple. The Americans rode in the style which I noticed they all adopt. It does not look well according to our ideas, for they slouch in the saddle and flap their elbows, sitting with their legs sticking out straight as if the horse had tar or something on its ribs, which the rider wanted to keep clear of. They seem to hold their reins in any sort of way, in each hand, and up to their chins being the favorite method, which looks awkward, to say the least of it. After them came one or two Filipinos, who all ride very well by instinct, sitting their horses firmly and gracefully, with flat thighs, and moving as if they were part of their mount, so that it is a pleasure to look at them. The little ponies and horses of the Filipinos pranced and curvetted about in a most engaging manner, which desirable result is brought about by means of an ingenious contrivance, borrowed from the Spaniards, of a sharp iron spike which runs into the roof of the horse's mouth when the rein is pulled, causing the animal to fret and foam and sidle to the admiration of beholders, who wonder how the rider can be so brave and cool with such a spirited steed. After this little cavalcade had got past, the procession proper came along, headed by a military band from Guimaras, playing extremely well, and a long column of American soldiers, all in khaki and wearing khaki felt sombreros, such as our troops adopted in the Boer War, turned up at one side and with a narrow blue cord knotted in front, the ends finished off with two small blue acorns. They marched very well, all looking as exactly alike as so many toy soldiers on an expanding frame. You know the things? All very tall men, with long, handsome faces, narrow shoulders, and long, thin legs, not at all a robust type, no wiriness and no depth about them. After the soldiers came a dozen or so of ordinary civilians in white linen suits and sombreros, with stars and medals on their breasts. They were followed by a similar group of men on foot, and these two little bands represented the veteran army of the Philippines, which includes anyone who volunteered in any capacity during the war. We told C he ought to be in that company, or at least to have a medal, as he was once made a temporary lieutenant and fought for the Americans in Samar. I think, however, that the VIP, as they call it, confines itself to American volunteers. With the American craze for societies and so forth, the VIP are a sort of brotherhood, and have lodges and badges and meetings and all that sort of thing. They gave a dance when we first came here, to which we went, and were awfully disgusted when we arrived to find that we had come too late for a solemn lodge meeting at which some ceremony had been performed. After the VAP came a lot of Philippine scouts, quite the opposite build to the American soldiers, as they were very small, square men with brown, square faces, high shoulders, long bodies, and short legs. Sturdy-looking little people, and looking very trim and smart in their neat khaki uniforms. Their band followed them, and behind that came the constabulary, more little square brown brothers in white gala suits with their band. A string of carriages came next, decorated, wheels and all, with stars and stripes, flags, and filled with all sorts of Americans, Filipinos, mestizos, and Spaniards, men and women, a very gay crowd. Following them was the fire brigade, consisting of natives marching on each side of an old hand pump, like a thing on a sailing ship, and carrying a most amusing banner painted with a picture of a house on fire, where a man in the middle distance worked a hose with a Niagara pouring out of it, while in the foreground a huge woman holding a giant baby sat on a packing case amongst a lot of very small furniture. Next came a Filipino baseball team in khaki knickerbockers and black shirts, with Atletica in large white letters across their chests, after the fashion of that baseball team we once saw play in the gardens of the Mongeese. The great feature of the procession was a large car decorated with a quantity of American flags and portraits of Washington, surmounted by a big pasteboard column striped red and white, on the top of which lay a scroll of paper, held down by a gigantic gilt inkpot with a mammoth quill stuck in it, and on the scroll was written Constitution in big letters. All the men in the portworks went past, some carrying hammers, and some bearing, between 5 or 6 of them, immense long boring rods for blasting. They were Filipinos, of course. In fact, with the exception of the American soldiers and a dozen or so of the occupants of the carriages, the whole procession was Filipino, all quite pleased and childlike to march about with banners to Sousa's stirring tunes. I don't suppose 1 in 20 of the little brown brothers had the vaguest idea what their big white brothers were so rejoicing about, or if they had ever heard of Townsend and the stamp duties, they would think the commemoration of the removal of a yoke of foreign bad government and taxation was something to do with their own everlasting struggle for independence. Besides this comical side to the rejoicings, there was the absurd anomaly that a great part of the funds for this celebration had been contributed by the British commercial houses. Well, it was an interminable string of people. The normal schools of Haro, La Paz, Molo, etc., each under their own banner, a long file of boys and then girls in all sorts of outfits and colors, but the girls all wearing the Filipino camisa, and many of them carrying the branches of artificial and gilt flowers, which they use in religious processions. It was particularly noticeable that there was no priest of any sort in the procession, nor were the priestly colleges or the convent schools represented in any way. We got quite tired of watching them at last, especially as the whole thing kept on getting muddled up and having to stop for long, weary halts. We came to the conclusion at last that as there was no crowd in the street or at the end of it, there must be a tiger round the corner. But a very literal Scotch friend said, "There are no tigers in the Philippines." A dance was given by the Spanish Club last night, and there is to be another tonight, at the invitation of the Presidente of the town, at his official residence, the Gobierno. I am not well enough to go to both, for I have not been out of the house for weeks, and even now it is rash to stand at all till my feet are healed. But I felt I must go to one of these functions, so I have chosen tonight, which is, according to Iloilo notions of etiquette, far the less exclusive of the two, so it will be much the more amusing. I have been writing this, lying in my long chair in the sala, while C went out to the plaza to see if he could hear any speeches or anything funny. He has just come back and tells me there was a platform erected in the plaza where speeches had been rolled off, but he had been too late to hear any of them. A great pity, as I dare say they may have been amusing, because one of the speakers was a rabid pro-Filipino, and the other, both Americans, a keen pro-American. I will finish this letter tomorrow so as to be able to tell you all about the ball. July 5. We went for a drive yesterday, late in the afternoon, and when we got as far as the plaza, we found a terrific fiesta in progress. All the lamp posts decorated with stars and stripes and Japanese lanterns, and a huge stage covered with palms and more stars and stripes put up opposite the bandstand and full of Americans, while vast crowds of Filipinos surged below, the men in white and the women in colors like those in a cheap church window, and it all looked very gay and pretty. I was very much surprised to see all this, as I had had no idea anything of the sort was in contemplation, and I was sorry that neither I nor the other Englishwoman had been invited to the stand, but I suppose they thought we would not care to take part in rejoicings over the Declaration of Independence, although our countrymen had contributed, by request, a great part of the funds for the celebration. We pulled up and looked on for a little while, much interested in a tug-of-war which was unlike anything we had ever seen. The two sides, Filipinos, stood on a long wooden frame like a gigantic ladder lying on the ground, and on this they lay at opposite ends, with their purchase on the rungs, and pulled at the rope with no effect whatever to the amateur eye. But apparently some man in command thought otherwise, for a voice suddenly sang out that one side had won, whereupon the competitors all let go the rope and felt quite limp, and then got up and walked away. They had races, too, and a greasy pole, no, 2 greasy poles, of bamboo, with a packet of money at the top, and of course a flag of stars and stripes. Up these the enterprising native youth of Iloilo swarmed, to the intense joy of the onlookers, who howled and roared with appreciation. All sorts of dodges were allowed, which were ingenious, if not particularly sporting. One small boy tried to get to the top by covering his hands and feet with sand, with which his pockets were laden and bulging, while the man who eventually got to the money hoisted himself by a device of bars of wood and rope, which betrayed him at once to sea as a sailor. We very nearly gave up waiting for this enterprising mariner, who took an immense time to get up to the thin part at the top of the pole, where he could abandon his contrivance and get his hands round the bamboo. But he secured the prize, and the people below bellowed with delight. There were very few Americans amongst the crowd, all the officers and officials being in the stand, with many ladies in light frocks and big hats, while the rank and file could be seen in the bars round the plaza, not caring a rap about tugs of war or greasy poles, or their little brown brothers. In the jail, the prisoners were crowded at the barred windows, getting what fun they could out of the general atmosphere of liberty, and as we drove round the plaza, I saw a most ragged and miserable young countrywoman carrying a sad, puny baby at her breast, talking to her man through the bars of the prison, where the female relations come and hand food in to the dark, ragged fellows inside. She slunk away round the plaza, and her face was too pitiful for words. She was so gaunt and haggard. We had no money with us, but I doubt if she would have taken it if we offered it to her, as the country people are very proud and very sensitive about vergüenza, which is Spanish for shame. Very few of the white people seem to understand this vergüenza, by an appeal to which, as I told you before, wonders can be done with a Filipino. This little incident put me out of humor with the Declaration celebrations, so we drove out onto the Molo Road a little way and then returned, and I had a good long rest before dinner to prepare me for the evening's festivities. The day wound up with the ball at the Gobierno, which is a kind of government house comprising public offices and the law courts and so forth. It is a big building across the end of the Calle Real, with a large overhanging balcony or veranda, under which the carriages pulled up on a stone flag pavement, all muddled up anyhow, anywhere, each one turning and going out in any direction the horse chose, with the usual shouting and confusion and swearing on all sides. The big stone basement was decorated with palms tied against the columns, and stars and stripes, and all up the staircase more stars and stripes and more palms. The ball went on chiefly in the courtroom, a long, narrow apartment where the scheme of decoration was half a dozen huge American flags draped over the walls, and stowed away over one doorway a few folds of the red and yellow of Spain. On one side of the courtroom, through wide arches, was another long room, and on the street side was the long balcony, open to the night and cool when compared to the rooms. When we arrived, the ball was in full blast with the official rigodon, which C and Mr. M, who went with us, did not care to dance, and I could not, so we sat in a row and looked on, and I talked to an American friend who we had met as we came in. He asked me to dance, but I said that was not possible for me, as my feet were still unhealed and all bandaged up for this dance. "Oh," he said cheerfully, "I guess you are right to be careful, because if you neglect those things, they turn into tropical ulcers, which are incurable." "Do they?" I said. "Why, yes. I had a friend who got mosquito bites poisoned just so, and he died of them." In spite of this, however, I spent a very cheerful evening, and was quite rewarded for the trouble of going out by the spectacle itself. For some time our American friend remained by us, as he said it was the last chance he would have of seeing us to say goodbye, because he was going back to the United States. We asked him if he were going on leave, but he said no, he was giving up his appointment, which rather surprised us, as he is one of the chief officials here and has a very good position. But he said he simply could not stand the Philippines any longer, and would rather work for half the pay in any other country. Besides, he said, I am entirely out of sympathy with the whole thing, and can't see what we are doing here anyway. I said, "But you have the country to develop." "Oh, I'm sick of hearing that," he said. "What I want to do is to go right back to the States and see some development done there." "Where do you mean?" we asked. "Why, in my own state alone there are hundreds of miles of virgin soil, which I reckon I want to see developed before these silly old islands." "Ah," I said, "then you don't like the Philippines. Have you ever met anyone who does?" "No," I said. "At any rate, not one American who does not loathe the place, except one woman, the wife of a missionary, who says she likes it, but then she spends all the disagreeable season in Japan." "That's so," he said, "and I guess if I come back it's going to be on the religious stunt, with no work and lots of vacation." The guests at the ball were all sorts and conditions of men, rather what C calls a heterogeneous mass, but most of the Americans were there too, and several new people whom I learned were officers and their wives from Camp Jossman over in Guimaras. One little woman particularly took my fancy, with her pale, pretty face and masses of fair hair, and a really lovely pink silk ball dress. She looked so fresh and charming, but I felt quite anxious about her nice dress, as my own black skirt was a source of trouble on such dirty boards, where, I am sorry to say, some of the guests did not hesitate to expectorate when they felt inclined for this national pastime. The floor, as I say, was simply rough, unpolished, dusty, dark wood planks, and all the American men, except our friend and two others, wore day suits and boots, while many of the women had on walking shoes, which did not improve things. The natives were all got up in blinding colors, little dark, square-faced women in the harsh aniline dyes of 30 years ago, and some of them had on very handsome diamonds. C and I and Mr. M were the only English people present. I believe the others, as well as many of the Americans, all thought the official ball not sufficiently select, which seemed to me a very amusing point of view in a place like Iloilo, or anywhere else for the matter of that. After watching the ballroom for a little while, we thought we would like some fresh air, so we moved out onto the balcony where the air was fairly cool, and where the band was stationed on a platform of 2 steps in height. This was the constabulary, native brass, which sounds very well out of doors in a procession, but is rather deafening in a room. On the platform were 2 or 3 music stands at which a few men lounged, but the rest of the 25 sat and blew, all brass and 2 flutes, wherever they pleased, most of them festooned gracefully about the steps of the stand, some lying almost full length on one elbow, and some huddled up with their chins on their knees, looking exactly like performing monkeys. One man with strips of black sticking plaster on his flat brown face lay on the steps of the stand, gazing at the ceiling and playing his cornet in one hand. There were benches all round a balcony, and on one of these we sat, in company with a lot of other guests, while some energetic and perspiring dancers came out and extended the ball to the balcony, dancing solemnly up and down in front of the band. When some people moved away from the bench nearest the platform, half a dozen bandsmen instantly took possession of their vacant places and sat there, leaning back and blowing away at greater ease. They seemed to be playing instinctively while thinking of other things. One small boy on the bench by us was fast asleep, with his fingers still moving up and down on the stops, which so interested Mr. M. that he got up and put his ear down to the fellow's trumpet, but declared he could hear no sound coming out of it at all. The other bandsmen watched him do this with impassive, expressionless faces if they looked at him at all. This was during the second rigodon, which we could see going on in the long courtroom, and when the last figure was reached, a bandsman suddenly sprang up from a recumbent position on the steps and tootled the first few bars of Hiawatha, which they all struck into with a swing, and some of the sleepers opened one dull eye, while the man with the black sticking plaster on his face was suddenly galvanized into walking up and down to the tune, a sort of dancing walk in front of the bandstand. While we sat by the band, we were joined by another American friend, also a prominent citizen, with whom I had a long and interesting shout about the Philippines in general, and Mr. Taft in particular, which was most entertaining, for this friend was as ardent a pro-Filipino as the other had been anti-Taft and anti-everything. This man was very enthusiastic about Mr. Taft's scheme, as he called it, and when I said, "What scheme?" he replied, "Why, the way we run these islands." Whereupon we entered upon a hot discussion, for I was all in favor of roads and irrigation, and he was all for school desks and more teachers. I quoted a paragraph I had seen in the Manila papers where the public were informed that some new and wonderfully fertile valley had been opened up in the island of Luzon, and that the government's first care had been to send 10,000 school desks to this favored spot. Whereupon he said, "Well, what is the matter with that, anyway?" I begged him to consider what Ceylon would be now if Sir Samuel Baker had opened it up with school desks instead of roads and reservoirs. "Oh," he said, "I never thought of it in that way, but perhaps our idea of raising these races is right. It is an experiment which time will prove." And that we argued, too, with a running comment of amusement on the baile, in spite of the loud blasts of the band. Before we left, we had excellent supper in a side room, where 2 long tables stood covered with food, and all the ceiling was draped with loops of greenery and paper lanterns. There were plates set out, each with a helping of excellent cold turkey in the middle, surrounded by little piles of stuffing and vegetables and things, which we followed by very nice meringues, and accompanied with delicious iced drinks, ice from the government factory, such a treat. While we were at supper, standing at one of the long tables, a paper lamp flared up and fell in a flaming mass just behind me. C and some Spaniards promptly stamped it out, but some of the women were frightened, so the Spaniards sang out, "Terminado, terminado," and everyone went on eating again. A little group of natives and mestizos came into the room immediately afterwards, but they had not seen the lamp fall, and one of the women in a light trailing gown passed over some smoldering fragments. C sprang forward and said in Spanish, "Your dress, there has been a lamp burnt there," and pointed to the sparks. But the woman merely glared over her shoulder as if he had offered her some insult. I could gladly have stuck my fork into her impudent, bold, brown face, and can't as yet see why in the eternal fitness of things she did not catch fire and flare up. After supper we watched a waltz and a two-step, and then went away about 12. On our way out, I passed one of the alcove openings into the inner room, where I saw a sad, white Boogaroo Madonna face looking up at a man bending down, and recognized one of the heroines of the late Funcion, a delightful Spanish slang word, next door. So I perceived that the marble misery was a chronic pose, and nothing at all to do with her relations stabbing each other, Only I must say she looked more in the picture, running down the street with her hair streaming, than in a bright ballroom. We had gone to the baile in a hired kile, as we did not want to take our own frisky pony out on such a night of Chinese crackers underfoot and rockets overhead, and we had told the kile man to come back for us. To our astonishment, he did so. Not that it was much of a treasure in the way of a carriage, for it was so badly balanced that our weight at the back would have lifted the pony clean off the ground if the driver had not kept the balance by squatting on the shafts over the pony's tail. The little animal tore along, and it was a wonder and a mystery to see how the driver stuck on at all. It was probably chiefly done with his toes, for Filipino toes stand apart, supple like fingers, and are used in the most marvelous and uncanny ways. In the streets, the Filipinos wear, or ought to wear, only slippers of gaudy velvet called chinelas, but many of them now affect stockings and pointed shoes, which I think must be one of the most doubtful blessings of civilization. In the procession, I noticed many of the little schoolgirls and boys with stockings on and awful shoes, and one or two of the little girls even wore hats, but if I described them to you, you would not believe me. Well, have you ever had such a long letter in your life? And yet there is any amount more to tell you if I only had the energy to write it. End of section 35. Section 36 of An Englishwoman in the Philippines by Mrs. Gambier Dauncey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ted Lienhart. Letter 36. Cockfighting, Pulahanis. Iloilo, July 14, 1905. I know you will be sorry to hear that the last of our dear little Mongeese is dead, killed by the dogs next door a week ago. We heard squeaking and barking and scuffling in the alleyway one evening and rushed to the windows, but it was all dark below and we could see nothing. So C and Sotero went down with a lamp, but there was nothing to be seen, and when we sent in to ask the old Tagalog dressmaker about it, they all swore they had heard nothing. So we hoped it was only a rat, but we waited in vain for our poor little pet to come back, and she never appeared again. I could not bear the sight of the empty cage and made the boys take it away after a day or two, and now I find it stands on the azotea, with Sotero's rooster sitting solemnly on a perch that has been fixed across the middle. This is the same cock, by the by, that traveled back with us from Nagaba, and when C asks the boy about it, he always says it is going to fight for 15 pesos on some Sunday, which never comes. The cock is as tame with Sotero as a dog, and allows itself to be combed and stroked the way one sees all the Filipinos do to their fighting cocks. In the native huts, the fighting cock is a very precious and sacred person, enthroned on a special perch at one end of the living room. The night before he fights, this warrior is watched with the greatest care to see which point of the compass he faces, as on that omen hang many events, for if the creature faces the east, he is bound to win, but if he is turned towards the west, you may as well not take him to the battle at all. A little hope is left, however, for when the cocks all crow before the dawn, he who makes the first squawk is bound to win, and you can put your last peseta on him. The poor beasts are taken to the ring, where spurs of curved steel are fastened to the back of their heels, which makes the fight pretty short and decisive, and may be indirectly merciful if it helps towards a swift death. The making of the blades is a fine art, and they are carefully carried about in a small box with a little stone on which to sharpen them. When one sees a Filipino on the way to a cockfight, with his bird sitting on his arm, there is generally another native walking beside him, carrying this little black box containing the spurs and the little whetstone. There is as much roguery and doping amongst these cockfighters as there is about horse racing amongst civilized men, and some of the dodges are really very ingenious, such, for instance, as taking tiny pills of opium or other poison under the fingernail and dropping them in front of your opponent's bird when it is pecking about before the contest begins. Before the fight, the interested parties are allowed to test the roosters, like looking at a horse in the paddock only they enjoy advantages which I believe are not to be indulged in a paddock at a race meeting, for they may form their opinion of a bird by picking the animal up and feeling its muscles, looking at its thighs and examining its feet, of all of which points the Filipino is a wonderful judge, being able to graduate his large bets on the feeling of a muscle with great certainty. All the same, this is the occasion, if he is so minded and the other man is not quick enough, to injure the animal by means of a sharp pin point hidden in the palm of the hand or between the fingers. I notice that the fighting cocks here don't have their breasts pulled bare of feathers like those poor birds we saw in that old man's house below the walls of the Alhambra. Do you remember how bald and horrible they looked? And how the old villain who kept them told us he pulled the feathers out and rubbed in spirits to keep the skin hard? They don't seem to do that here, for I have never seen a bare-breasted cock, and never met anyone who has heard of such a custom. The general has gone off to Samar, the Long Island parallel to this, and on the other side of Cebu, though I can only use those terms vaguely and by way of a general indication to you where to look on a map. The island is now under martial law, owing to the patriotism and enterprise of certain jolly fellows called pulahanes, going about with big curved bolos and old Spanish flintlocks, and in fact anything they can catch hold of. These persons are really patriots of a most irreconcilable type, but it suits the program of the government to label them ladrones, robbers, and to refer to their own hard fights with them as cleaning up the province. On the strength of this nickname, the Americans cut down these patriots freely, when the pulahanes do not do the cutting down first, and if they catch them alive, the poor devils are hanged like common criminals. Note: I have before me a cutting from the Manila Times containing an account of the arrival in Manila by the transport Dix from San Francisco of, quote, 11 strong-limbed, square-jawed bloodhounds, end quote, for the work of trailing the ladrones of Cavite and the pulahanes of Samar. End note. The papers continue to publish long eulogiums on the peace and prosperity of the Philippines, and all the time the richest commercial center of the archipelago is under martial law, with all its business houses shut down, and soldiers and officers continue to arrive at the hospital here every now and then with more or less severe wounds. Also, wagons occasionally go past from the barracks, piled up with baggage and followed by troops in service kit, and one hears that they have gone to the front. For some time past, the staff of C's firm has been increased here in this Iloilo branch by the absorption into it of one of their men from Catbologan, the chief town of Samar, as their business there, along with all the others in that island, has had to be shut down. There is desultory fighting even here in Panay, but we never hear of it except as an occasional paragraph in a Manila paper. So much for peace. As to prosperity, there is general scarcity. Many districts suffer actual famine. In Cebu, the lower classes are chiefly dependent on an allowance of so many sacks of rice a day, the gift of the Chinaman. In that town, indeed, matters are so bad that siege-like conditions prevail, and amongst other horrible things that happened, a starving native woman lately killed and ate her own baby. This is not hearsay, but sober reports in the Manila Times. I am paying the penalty of my recklessness in having gone to the Declaration Day ball, for the little walking I did that night made my feet very painful again, and I am laid up in bed once more, reading papers and trying to forget my American friend's optimistic remarks about tropical ulcers. The doctor tells me I want feeding up to get the poison out of my system, and this I can quite believe, but fail to see how it is to be brought about. I have tried drinking a little wine, but that makes my prickly heat unendurable. The Spaniards here drink tinto, the red Spanish wine one gets at tables d'hôte in Spain, but it has to be spirited up for export, so out here it is rather heady and sour. But I am sure it must be more wholesome than the whiskey and soda of the English people, or the eternal tea of the American women. You will be tired of hearing about my mosquito bites, but I must just tell you one new thing that I have heard about this unpleasant ailment, which is that many people think the poison is introduced by flies. One fly would be quite enough. There were no flies, or very few, when we came here at first, in the dry season, but with the rain they have appeared in black swarms, and we live surrounded by large sheets of sticky paper with tanglefoot written on them, a delightful American expression. Here again I am reminded of the amount of indifference shown to an animal in proportion to its size, comparative with that of a human being. For can you imagine anyone being tolerated who caught cats or horses in deep, thick glue and let them slowly struggle to death? Yet what are you to do with flies? You can't catch each one. First catch your fly, in fact, and then kill it in the quickest and most scientific manner. No, it must be tanglefoot papers. But even though I find I am simply compelled to have them about the house, when I see a fly trying to haul one foot after the other out of the dreadful tanglefoot, I can't help appreciating the poor insect's point of view. The old millionaire I told you about is still here, and everyone is trying to be civil to him, but I hear he is very difficult to entertain, for he insists on being the only man to talk, which he does very slowly and in an almost unintelligible accent. He gives considerable annoyance, too, by his bad clothes, dirty hands, and unshaven face, and one can't help sympathizing with the men who are irritated by such slovenliness, or agreeing with them that it is not much good being a millionaire if you can't get hold of a decent tailor and a razor and some soap. I think I told you that our friend Mr. Blank sent his wife and family off to Hong Kong when the heat began. They have come back and are giving me so much annoyance by rhapsodies over the climate, the cheapness of everything, and the good food in Hong Kong that at last I had to beg them to say no more. Mrs. Blank is still comparing prices here with prices there, and she brought back pretty things for her house, which make me wild with envy, or would if we were not soon to pass to happier climes. Her husband went to fetch his little tribe, and he is raving, not so much about the comparison of prices and the joys of fresh milk, fruit, and vegetables, as the horrible imposition of being compelled to pay the Philippine cedula tax all over again. 5 pesos a head, 10 shillings each for his wife, the 3 children, and the nurse. And what annoyed him most of all, I think, was his having been away about 3 weeks himself and having to pay it again, too. However, it has been worth the money to them, I should think, for they all look quite brown and jolly compared to the people here, and quite different beings to the washed-out folk they were when they went away. At this time of year, as I think I told you, all the Hong Kong people who can afford it go home or to Shanghai or Japan, as they consider Hong Kong at this season not fit to live in. End of section 36. Section 37 of An Englishwoman in the Philippines by Mrs. Gambier Dauncey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ted Lienhart. Letter 37, A Pearl of Great Price. Iloilo, July 14, 1905. We are having much cooler weather now, the thermometer sometimes as low as 77 degrees and hardly ever above 80 degrees, and at night it has even been down to 64 degrees. We have had some spells of hot sunshine, which have brought the flowers out in the few gardens and the cemeteries. We get a trayful now and then of all sorts of queer-looking blossoms, mostly bright reds and yellows with no smell, and very gaudy and handsome. Many of them I have seen in hothouses at home, especially one big, bright, yellow, funnel-shaped flower, but I don't know any of their names, except the native words told me by the charming white-haired old Filipino gardener who brings them. Amongst the last lot was a thing exactly like a large periwinkle, which made me think at once of the garden at home, and some stuff like May blossom, which made me feel more homesick than ever. They are beautiful, all these flowers, when they come in fresh, but there is no scent about them, and they seldom live 24 hours. One I do recognize, and that is the canna lily, which I have seen in hothouses at home, and some irises of different sorts. I am feeling much better, so we went for a drive yesterday between the showers, but got caught in 2 tremendous squalls, one in the town and one on the Molo Road. The Calesa has a hood, which is raised on crooks, and one can shut oneself in altogether and heavy rain, with an arrangement of waterproof curtains, the rains passing through a hole in the high apron. It looks so funny in wet weather to see the bottled-up calasses going about, being driven as by magic, with the miserable sota, groom, trying to make the best of his narrow perch behind. The roads were a maze of huge pools of water, through which we just splashed anyhow, and all the palm groves were brilliantly green and full of new little fairy lakes, which looked so lovely that they were well worth the discomforts of the drive. Near the huge priest's college, a little way out of Iloilo, we saw some carabaos having a glorious time in various new pools. They looked very picturesque, with their great dark curved horns standing out against the shining water and the green grass. The greenness is wonderful, too wonderful. There is no beauty of purples and soft blues about a wet day here. It is all gray and green, and even the little lakes in the palm groves are very garish and all exactly alike. One longs for a change of coloring, and these crude tints get on one's nerves like an oleograph in a hotel. Talking of nerves, the perpetual sounds were added to, as soon as the rainy season set in, by the bell-like voices of countless frogs singing in every ditch and pool. They sing in the day, but at night they are loudest, or else most noticeable, and their melodious notes might be pretty if one heard less of them and a long way off. A day or two ago, Sotero came to me saying that a woman was at the door wanting to sell me a ring. I said I would look at it, so he went off and brought me a dirty little piece of newspaper, out of which emerged a huge pearl set in a very common florid claw setting. I looked at the pearl and saw that though it was white enough, it was very rough, with no iridescent luster, what connoisseurs call skin, I believe. I also noticed that as the stone tapered away and was discolored under the setting, it could not be worth more than 10 pounds at the most. But Sotero said the woman wanted 200 pesos, 20 pounds, so the incident came to a rapid close. When C came back in the middle of the day and I told him about the ring, he said he knew it quite well, for it had been hawked all over Iloilo, and everyone thought the price asked a preposterous sum, in spite of which the woman refused all reasonable offers. The pearl came from the pearl fisheries of the Philippines, which are chiefly in the Sulu Islands, far away south, where the Philippines almost touch British North Borneo. They say the pearls are not very good ones at the best, but none of the best specimens find their way about the islands, for they are sent straight away to Singapore by the Chinamen who own the fisheries. Here there are oysters with beautiful, transparent, white pearl shells, of which the small panes of the rain shutters are made. But these shells have no pearls in them, and are of very little value. Besides these oysters, we get all manner of shellfish, crabs, crayfish, clams, shrimps, as well as soles, sprats, whiting, and quantities of other fish. Indeed, the supply of fish is wonderfully varied, and always exquisitely fresh, except on Fridays, when the servants of all good Catholics clear the markets, or even secure the fish before they get into the markets at all. In stormy weather, too, we don't get much fish, but as a rule the supply is a great boon, and one of our chief sources of sustenance. I was astonished to find in Manila that fish was very scarce and dear, and people there envied us the fish here, while those who only knew Manila refused even to believe that we could have such a supply at all. End of section 37. Section 38 of An Englishwoman in the Philippines by Mrs. Gambier Dauncey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ted Lienhart. Letter 38. Agricultural Possibilities. Iloilo, July 31st. I think I told you we had been very lucky in the selling of the greater part of our furniture, and now we have got the calesa and pony off our hands as well, which is a great loss in the evenings, but we had to take what chance we could. Some of the young Englishmen got up a gymkhana on the beach yesterday, and C rode the pony for the last time, when he was lucky enough to win 2 races out of 3, and only missed the third by a misunderstanding about the start. It was a dull, showery afternoon, unfortunately, but when the rain went off, I strolled down to the beach to see if anything was to be seen. I found crowds of Filipinos standing about the upper part of the beach and a few hurdles down on the sands, which the receding tide had left quite firm. The competitors, who included some of the young Spaniards and mestizos, were riding up and down, and just as I arrived on the scene, a race came flying along in great style, to the intense joy of the native onlookers. The occasion was enlivened by the Banda de Musico Popular, the members of which had been on their way to play in the plaza, but had strolled down to the beach, where they stood amongst the crowd, and every now and then blew and tootled a tune while they goggled about. I signaled to our soda and made him go up to the house and fetch me a chair, on which I sat and watched the race. As I sat there, a Filipino youth came up and very civilly asked me if the señora wanted a muchacho, but I said I did not, as I was quite content with the servants I had at present. We have had 1 or 2 very fine days again lately, and have been for 1 or 2 drives, but some very bloodthirsty road mending has been going on to prepare the town for the critical eyes of the Taft party, who are to arrive here from Manila on the 14th or 15th of next month. This road mending is done by hauling the volcanic gravel out of the riverbeds and dumping it in huge piles along the middle of the roads, and as the thoroughfares are not lighted, the result is a wild steeplechase with one wheel in the air. Sometimes fellows come along and spread the gravel out, but more generally it just spreads itself. It makes very soft roads, which the heavy caribou carts plow up at once. One of the last drives we took was to visit the foreign cemetery, which is on the outskirts of the town, on a road running parallel to the beach. We got out of the trap at a tall wooden gate, which an old man opened to us, and walked up a short avenue of flowering bushes and palms. The grave stood on a grassy plot, with bushes growing about it, laden with large red or yellow blossoms, and crossed at right angles by sandy paths bordered with tiles. They were not ordinary graves, like those one sees at home. For each one was a sort of small brick tunnel some feet from the ground and closed by a cemented tablet. There were names of some English people on 1 or 2 of them, and one had just been opened to send the bones of the occupant back to his native land. The man had been dead 25 years, and it seemed to me hardly worthwhile to disturb him. A little behind the main row of tombs, we came on a Jewish grave, a big marble sarcophagus with an iron rail round it and inscriptions in Hebrew on the flat top. The marble was native to this country, I have no doubt, as there is plenty of it in the Philippines. In fact, some of the small islands are known to be of solid marble, but it does not pay to work them. Did I not tell you this before, though? Mr. B came to call this afternoon and was very indignant about local justice, as it appears that one of his Filipino clerks was impudent to a white man in his firm, whereupon the white man naturally struck the Filipino as any ordinary man of grit strikes a man who is rude to him. However, the cur Filipino went off to the police and lodged a complaint. The white man was had up and has been heavily fined for assaulting the Filipino, and Mr. B says, "What on earth are you to do with impertinent natives if you don't hit them? They don't care a straw if you dismiss them, and take not the least notice of reproof." But I think there is right on both sides, for the way some of the white men hit their servants about is brutal and foolish. I said something to this effect, whereupon Mr. B said, very much surprised, "Why, doesn't your husband have to kick your fellows about?" And he was quite incredulous when I assured him that C had never dreamed of such a thing except once, when our first cook had muttered impertinences and been kicked out onto the azotea for his rudeness. "But they are such stupid fools," argued Mr. B. We replied that we did not think blows would make them any brighter, on which he laughed and said perhaps we were right, as we certainly had remarkably good servants. Another guest, Mr. M., was talking about Philippine food and observed that tomatoes grew so well here. I said I thought they were miserable failures, as they are about the size of walnuts and quite green. But he maintained that was because the Filipino just sticks his tomato plants in the ground and goes off to sit in the shade or to a cockfight, and when he sees any sign of fruit on the plants, he picks it and takes it to market. Any notion of tilling the soil, weeding or manuring, is absolutely unknown to these people, or if known, carefully avoided. Mr. M. said he had seen tomatoes grown by Chinamen as good as the very best out of a hothouse at a home. There are several Chinese potageries in the town where rows of trim little beds may be seen thick with extraordinarily luxuriant crops of vegetables of every sort. But out here, no one will eat anything grown by the Chinamen, as those enterprising people employ some dreadful and unmentionable methods of agriculture. Besides this, there are many germs in the teeming, prolific air which invest vegetables such as cabbages, lettuce, etc., and make them very unsafe experiments, even if one can procure any. When I was in Manila, there was a good deal of talk at dinner tables and much writing in the papers about some American scientist who professed to have found a way to treat the Philippine green lettuces before eating them, so as to destroy some dreadful germ which causes horrible complaints. But it seemed to me less trouble and a great deal safer to give up lettuce as a bad job. The great and terrible fear in the Philippines is the germ of a disease called sprue, a sort of wasting away, which is very difficult to remedy and almost ineradicable. Melons would grow well here, for in the wet season anything in the nature of a gourd springs up like a weed, a habit which suits the Filipino agriculturist to perfection. Some of the more energetic spirits fasten a piece of bejuco from the marrow plant up to a window, and gourd vines may often be seen obligingly toiling up a string to hand fruit in to the weary dwellers in a nipa hut. Nevertheless, melons are only to be got from Hong Kong, and even then they are a costly delicacy. Some friends sent us half a watermelon a few days ago as a present, but we did not like to accept anything so valuable and insisted on paying for it. What a treat it was. With the rainy season, we also have a tiny, hard native fruit that looks like a damson outside, but has white flesh with a stone like a date stone, and is entirely devoid of any flavor of any sort. I tried having this fruit stewed, but it was even nastier than when raw. When we were at Nagaba for the day, in the spring, we got some fruit-like knobs of rose-colored wax, pink all through, with black pips, and rather tart, but also tasteless. I suppose all these insipid, nasty little native fruits could be cultivated into something nice, in the way that cherries have been developed, and apples and everything else from the tasteless wild fruit. At present, however, they are tolerable only to the native palate. The best of them is a tiny brown fruit called lazones, which has a fluffy, thin brown skin and gray-brown flesh in divisions like an orange, each division containing a large green seed. The flavor of the lazones is sharp, rather nice, and very refreshing, but this fruit only comes from Luzon and is very expensive, besides being half rotten by the time it gets here. Bananas, pineapples, and mangoes, that is all. Bananas one gets unutterably sick of, and pineapples too, and mangoes, even if one likes them, which we do not, give one prickly heat. In fact, tinned strawberries and raspberries are about the best Philippine fruits. We have received an invitation to the banquet in honor of Mr. Taft and his party on the 15th, on the payment of 12 pesos each, but we may have to sail before that date if our Hong Kong steamer comes in. I shall be very sorry if we miss that event, for I think the Taft utterances would be well worth 25 shillings a head, though that does seem a pretty stiff sum for an Iloilo banquet. End of section 38. Section 39 of An Englishwoman in the Philippines by Mrs. Gambier Dauncey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ted Lienhart. Letter 39. A Last Day at Nagaba, the Sec War. Iloilo, August 11, 1905. We went a last trip to Nagaba on Sunday, but only for the day, and were lucky in having very fine weather and delightfully cool, only 80 degrees with a lovely breeze blowing, and the sky a little overcast. We roused ourselves up after lunch, and 2 friends came to the house to join the party, and we sent the boy for 2 kilezes. When we went down, I stepped into the first one. There was Tuye lying in it already. How she knows when we are going out is simply marvelous. We drove to the Muel Loni, at the farther end of which paraos are moored for hire, and chose a nice big boat, the Valentino, with an upper deck of split bamboo, a rabbit hutch cabin of nipa matting, and a crew of 8 men, and set sail for Nagaba. The sun came out soon after we started, so we lay half in and half out of the cabin and the shade it cast. It was a 3-man breeze, so some of the crew ran out on the outriggers and others hauled ropes, while 3 ruffians sat on the deck, which was 3 feet wide, by the by, and spread out a piece of blue paper, which they held down with their bare brown toes. We could not think what they were going to do when, to our astonishment, one of them produced a pack of greasy cards and pieces of money and began the 3-card trick. They did their best to get us interested in the game, the chief little old brown swindler losing to his confederates, all in the best derby style. We looked on with deep interest, but showed no signs of wishing to take part in the gamble, except for C to ask casually if they knew he was in the secret police, which made them look quite serious for a few minutes. This remark about secret police was no empty jest, for it is an institution of the free and enlightened USA, worthy of Russia or the Dark Ages. Well, after this disquieting joke about the secret police, the 3-card trick seemed to lose its flavor, and the gamblers shifted billet again, to our intense amusement, crawling along the outriggers and past the cabin and on to the tiny space of afterdeck, where the steersman sat huddled up with his legs round the tiller. Here they spread the blue paper out again, one of the Confederates lying airily across the stern entrance, betting excitedly, with an occasional squint into the cabin to see if anyone was inclined to slip aft on the sly. But we never even looked round, so they soon abandoned that tactic and climbed onto the cabin roof, where they crouched like monkeys, chattering, and now and then a great flat brown face hung over the edge and looked down in on us. But we got rather tired of them, so C leaned out and hit one of them, and they gave that up too. All this time we were skimming through the water, going at a tremendous pace, the boat leaning over first to one side and then to the other, with the white foam spurting up from the brilliant green sea, the half-naked brown sailors running out on the long poles of the outriggers, and the big sails filled out tight. It was most exhilarating. We went straight across, a little wide of Nagaba, and then made a wide tack, which enabled the boat to go quite close to the beach, as the tide was high, and we came up right opposite the village. One of the boatmen carried me ashore, and the moment Tuye saw me leave the ship, she flung herself into the water and swam after me in a sort of tragic despair that made us all laugh very much. Then other brawny little natives took C and our 2 friends astride on their shoulders and set us all down on the dry sand, and we walked up through the little village of huts, all amongst the babies and dogs and pigs. There were several new swamps to be seen, and everything was even greener than when we were last there, which was before the southwest monsoon had really set in. I noticed, too, that the bushes had flowered, as our friends had predicted, and one of them was a beautiful, scentless yellow blossom, a little like a snapdragon. We had meant to go for a real walk, but the sun was too hot, as it was not more than 4 o'clock, so we wandered along to our house through the fields and village. It was delightful to feel the fresh country air and to smell the earth and plants after the streets of Iloilo, and we actually felt hungry and began to ask each other what was to be done about food. Nothing was to be had at any house in the village, as we all knew by experience, but by luck we came upon a sort of open nipa shed, where a little Filipino woman was standing behind a wooden tray containing ears of maize, little heaps of rice, and betel nut, which was by way of being a shop. From her, and a youth who cropped up from nowhere and conducted the bargaining, we bought what the Americans call corn pone, which is whole ears of young maize roasted. We munched the corn, which was very sweet and tender, and uncommonly filling. After about half a pone, one could hardly breathe. A little further on, we regretted our haste in satiating ourselves with maize, as we saw a big open shed with 2 steps up to it, and all sorts of glasses and dishes glittering on a table spread with a white cloth, evidently a sort of fiesta restaurant. We cheered up at this and hurried along with talk of fizzing drinks, but when we came nearer and out of the full glare of the sunlight, we got a horrible shock on finding it to be the Anglipay church. So we trailed on, rather despondent and very thirsty, between the huts and boats, through the deep, soft sand, which was unpleasant to walk on. We saw a big parayo lying drawn up, hewn out of one vast tree trunk, which is the original model of these long, narrow boats, and it looked like a huge baroto canoe. When we got to the house, Tuye was greeted most enthusiastically by a little spaniel friend, and the caretakers were civil enough to us, but incredibly stupid about a request for coffee. At last, C made them understand by talking to them in Visayan, but it is really very strange how very few of the people in the country know any Spanish, and the townspeople can only say a few words or phrases at the best. We took chairs out of the house, opened the sliding bamboo frames shutting off the balcony, and established ourselves out there in the cool shade. There we sat for an hour, munching maize and watching 3 fowls and 3 brown babies picking up mysterious food on the rocks and in the shallow pools. One of the babies was an elderly person of 5 or 6 who was minding the other 2, and one could see that he was older and more important, as he had on a very short and entirely foolish white muslin shirt, but the other 2 were in nothing but fat brown skin. The tiniest was a very serious and bullet-headed little chap, with thin arms and legs and a huge rice tummy. All 3 mites were squatting about, very busy and solemn, finding some little shellfish which they cracked between stones and ate with the gestures of monkeys. They were to us a source of absolute delight, and it was not till the elderly pastor in the muslin shirt led his flock off to fresh pools out of sight that we went into the house and drank the coffee which the woman had prepared for us. It was excellent black coffee, made in the native fashion by holding the grounds in a little bag at the end of a piece of bamboo in a coffee pot. Simple but effective. With it went large flat cakes of yellowish sugar called caramelo, and she had also produced from somewhere 4 ship's biscuits. The latter were rather a relief after the maize, and indeed we thought the meal a delicious feast, though I have no doubt we would not have looked at it over the other side of the Guimaras Channel. After this, as it was about 6 o'clock and the sun was going down, we walked down to the river mouth and got on board the good ship Valentino by crawling along another parayo, which was beached in the shallower water further inshore, and thence by perilous ventures along those outriggers on which the sailors run about in a gale as if they were on firm land. The sailback in the sunset was exquisite, all the mountains of Panay dark blue against an orange sky, a young moon overhead, and the air exquisitely fresh. Altogether, it was a most delightful trip, and I only wish we had more such days, but with only 1 day a week to choose from, it is often too hot, and sometimes too wet to go on the water. Most of the time, too, I have not been well enough for expeditions under the most favorable circumstances, and then, over and above all these reasons, is the fact that one seldom has the inclination here to do anything or go anywhere. I think it must be owing to this latter phenomenon that there is no sort of weekend resort at Nagaba, for one can hardly understand how such an enterprising people as the Americans have neglected this golden opportunity for a business that, I believe, they understand so admirably. I mean sort of simple life hotels. I remember an American whom I met at home once in England telling me a long story about some place in the Adirondacks where people from New York, or was it Chicago, no matter, go and live in tents, and millionaires catch food, and their priceless wives and daughters cook and sweep. The story came up apropos the daughter of a millionaire who had just married an English duke, as this personage had been roughing it in the next tent to my friend. I think I may have told you the story at the time, but I have read so much and heard so much about the American love of country life that I am astounded to see how they all sit grilling in Iloilo when they might have a hotel at Nagaba. The truth is, of course, that such an enterprise might be a doubtful undertaking, as every American I have ever yet met or seen, from the highest to the humblest, is simply saving money to get away from the Philippines and back to God's country. We are still undecided about our departure, as the Sun King, the sister ship of the Kai Phong in the same line, has come in before what the Americans called her scheduled time. That is a very queer word of theirs, by the by, and they worked the poor thing to death, making it do all sorts of unnatural gymnastics in place of good, ready, useful English. Probably we shall wait for the Kai Fong, but whichever we decide for, we shall not miss the Taft party after all, which I am very pleased about, and we have put our names down for the banquet. They are in Manila now, the first intimation of their arrival having been a telegram in the Iloilo El Tiempo, headed Impresiones de Miss Alice Roosevelt, who had not been an hour in the Philippines, if she had landed at all, when the impression was what newspaper language calls voiced. Now we have the Manila Times of that in the following 2 days, which are all Taft, of course, set forth in the quaintest concoction of cheap picture writing, bad grammar, and awkward slapdash slang. Much about Miss Alice, a whole column of an interesting description of that lady's every gesture at a race meeting. In fact, she looms so large in the Philippine eye that it looks as if she were here for a very good reason, perhaps to take the fierce white light off Mr. Taft a little. They allude to the latter, by the by, as the Sec War, which, when I first came across it, I took to be the name of some Indian chief, but it at last dawned upon me that the word was a contraction of Secretary of War, and I have since been told that it is his telegraphic address used as an affectionate nickname. The American reporter seems to be as virulent in Manila as anywhere else, for before the party had landed, one of these human mosquitoes asked a senator what he thought of these islands, but the visitor cleverly replied that he had come to gather impressions, not to furnish them. The papers are still full of guesses about the true reasons for this visitation, for so many of them persist in the theory that Mr. Taft is not entirely actuated by altruistic wishes for the welfare of his little brown brothers, but has a wary eye upon the elector at home, and will pose as the saint of the Philippines just as far as his own interests are safe. I think it is a great shame to say this, however, for it is obvious that he has done the best he can for the Philippines according to his views, and whether one agrees with his theories or not, his good intentions are not to be denied. I had a long talk with a man who has been here in a good business for 33 years, and is supposed to know more about the Philippines than any other white man alive, and he told me that, as far as enlightening the senators went, he thought the Taft visit was a costly farce, for they are to be allowed to see and hear nothing that does not suit the Taft book. A week in Manila of meetings, balls, parties, and banquets, followed by flying visits to the principal towns in the provinces and more banquets, all feasting and flags and anthems, but not a glimpse of the miserable, wasted agricultural districts, the abandoned rice fields, and the real truth of the labor problem. Moreover, their opinion of the self-government problem is to be formed by the conversation of a few well-educated and carefully selected mestizos in the towns. The natives themselves, however, are tremendously jubilant about the approaching visit of their patron saint, and expect all blessings to spring up miraculously in his footsteps. Talking of natives, I am glad to say that our 3 excellent servants have found good billets, with a rise in importance and wages, and they are all so pleased, poor souls, that we took the trouble to recommend them to our friends. They did not want much touting, for the spotless tidiness of their appearance is an advertisement that speaks for itself, and their honesty is patent, for we trust them in a way that no one else dreams of doing with their Filipino servants. I don't know how the 2 houseboys will get on with impatient Englishmen, for they are both very shy, faithful, simple countrymen, real unspoilt Filipinos. But if they were spoken to sharply or muddled in their work, they would become confused and stupid at once. Not that there is anything peculiar to the Filipino race in these traits, because they are perfectly familiar to me in many kindly, simple, limited souls in other latitudes. You have to take them as you find them, only hoping, as with the same type at home, that their secret cunning may be ranged on your own side, and that if you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, you may perhaps manage to contrive a useful little leather bag if you are patient enough. Note, I have before me the Manila Times of 17th January 1906, from which I give the following extract, quote, "While the municipal and ecclesiastical dignitaries, etc., were awaiting the arrival of Secretary Taft, a government vessel slowly made her way up the Pasig River filled with the dead and wounded from the island of Samar. During the stay of the party in Manila, 4 native men were brought in from the adjoining province of Cavite, frightfully mutilated because of their pro-American sympathies. End of section 39. Section 40 of An Englishwoman in the Philippines by Mrs. Gambier Dauncey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ted Lienhart. Letter 40. Preparations. Iloilo, August 14, 1905. We have now decided to go to Hong Kong by the Kaifong, which sails next Saturday or Monday, the 20th or 22nd. The Sun King loaded up as much as she could and shoved off on Saturday, as she did not want to be paying port dues here the whole of today, Sunday, and tomorrow, which is a public holiday, being the anniversary of the taking of Manila by Admiral Dewey. The transport conveying the Taft party is scheduled to arrive here today, and this evening they are to be present at a performance of the Filipino Amateur Dramatic Club, to which we have been invited by means of a huge printed invitation, couched in elaborate Spanish and adorned by many ornaments and flourishes. We heard the sound of a band going past early this morning, and when we went out onto the balcony, we saw it was the infantry band from Guimaras, with the regiment behind them marching down the street. They marched splendidly, and the band was playing a most sad and beautiful tune, which made one think of war and troops marching away and women crying in the morning. The soldiers had just arrived, I expect, for everyone from Camp Jossman is pouring into Iloilo for the fetes for the Taft party. Arches are being put up in the streets, and as everybody has been requested to decorate their houses, we have hoisted a Union Jack on a long pole, and all this morning the servants were very happy in the pouring rain, sticking up palm branches which they had stolen from some plantation. They are much excited about the arrival of this hero of theirs, and one of them, who gets confused when we accuse him of being an independiente because he has his watch hung on a nail in the kitchen with a portrait of Rizal over it, a sort of little shrine, is simply beaming with delight and can't haul up enough palms. In the office opposite, the native clerks are surpassing themselves with archway and window decorations of greenery and flowers, while the old Tagalog dressmaker next door has been busy for a week past making paper flowers of all the hues under the sun. In that house, by the by, the stock of domestic pets has lately been increased by the addition of a sheep, which is quite tame, for we can hear its little hoofs tap-tapping over the bare boards and see it sitting amongst the work girls in the big front room. They have a nice little black pig, too, also running about the house and equally tame, and in the evenings the old man goes out for a walk to the beach with a fat old brown dog, the pig, and the sheep, all running after him and playing about. I have often seen them go along the street, such a curious company, and people who live near the beach tell me he takes them all down to the sea, washes them, and then walks about to give them an airing. They are all sharing in the popular rejoicings, too, for the brown dog and the pig have got on necklaces of paper flowers, while the sheep is crowned in the most Arcadian fashion. Mr. Taft has made a lot of speeches in Manila, but so far they have only contained very nebulous references to the independence question, though he has cast a sop to the malcontents by promises of abolition or reduction of certain export duties, by which the excited Filipinos argue and predict a millennium of agricultural improvement and general plenty. But none of the businessmen are very clear as to how this miracle is to be wrought, for the government will not lower the standard of wages, Chinese labor will not be allowed in, and the Filipino will not suddenly, if ever, become a thrifty, hard-working tiller of the soil, even if he passes all the standards of the American schools. One paragraph stowed away in a corner of the Manila Times made us laugh very much, for it was an account of how Poblete de los Reyes, a Filipino independiente agitator, and Father Iglipe were haunting the corridors of the Ayuntamiento, the Gobierno of Manila, but up to noon today they had failed to get the ear of Secretary Taft. This gave me a delightful vision of those two anxious, flat brown faces peering out of all sorts of shadowy places, and Mr. Taft forever making a break for another room and rushing through suites and up and down little staircases to escape the genuine patriots. This is only a fancy picture, of course, but still it may contain a grain of truth, and at any rate it afforded us much amusement. Many people think Mr. Taft is reserving some great pronouncement for Iloilo, as he favored this town above all Philippine communities in that he made here his great pro-Filipino speech 2 years ago when he was Governor General of the Philippines. In this famous oration, he used these words: "These Philippine Islands are going to be governed for the Filipinos, and no one but the Filipinos, and any stranger or American who does not like it can get out." This did much to ensure his popularity with the natives everywhere in the islands, and in Iloilo in particular. However, even the easygoing Americans seem to have grasped that these words went a little too far, for they tried to hush up that part of the speech, but the Filipinos, already fully alive to the blessings of a free press, seized on this utterance, and it was published in the Nuevo Heraldo, which is the Iloilo Independiente organ. The phrase got about everywhere and did much to shake public confidence in justice towards the white man, with incidental harm to trade and enterprise, but it pleased the little brown brother and added another step to the pedestal on which he has placed the patron saint. To the mere observer, however, this cry of altruism is not very convincing in face of the fact that the Philippines lie so conveniently on the west of the future Panama Canal. It was not brotherly love which prompted astute American politicians to wash off the Spaniards with rivers of blood and treasure, and I think the Filipino will find that he gets just as much of Philippines for the Filipinos as is contained in the other famous phrase of little brown brother, and no more. Gradually, too, he will find that to be a little brown brother out here will be the same sort of distinction as being a big black brother in the USA. In one of the last magazines we received from home is a description by some woman of a cruise in a tramp steamer in the Pacific, Lotus Islands, and all that sort of thing, and who wants to return to fretful Europe rhapsodies, which it struck me I should better have appreciated this time last year. But now all I think of is the utter mental sterility of such a life, which appears to me, in the light of experience, still more like the impression made by a beautiful and stupid woman. She winds up with a fine peroration about the spell of the ancient world, which binds one to the island home and the island life forever. I can't think what there is of the ancient world about a Pacific island, but the spell, if there is one, must be that of indolence, or the attraction, as in the case of Stevenson, simply a matter of health, for it seems to me that no other inducements could make one willingly lose touch of all that civilization has to offer to distinguish one from a South Sea islander. Of course, in the temperate climes there are the inconveniences of dress, frost, and drainage, but those are small when compared with art, books, good music, and intelligent fellow creatures. Oh, you can't imagine the deadliness of the lives the white people lead here, the indifference, the stagnation, the animal round of food and sleep. I think if it had been my fate to stay on in the island home and the island life forever, if I had not become physically ill, I must have become mentally an invalid for the rest of my life. End of section 40. Section 41 of An Englishwoman in the Philippines by Mrs. Gambier Dauncey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ted Lienhart. Letter 41, The Festivities. Iloilo, August 17, 1905. I must tell you all about this comitiva Taft dissipation, of which we had the first taste on Monday, the 15th, when a printed notice was left at our house saying that the congressional party had arrived that evening instead of next morning, and another large, flowery, and handsome invitation bidding us to a reception to be held at the house of the De La Ramos, very rich Filipinos, who have a fine house in a broad, shady street where the bank and some other big houses stand within gardens. The reception was to be followed by the performance at the Filipino Theater to which, as I told you, we had also been invited, but we thought that the reception, which was scheduled to come off at 8, would be quite enough for us for one evening. We dined early and sent Domingo out for a quile with a good horse. He came back after a long while and said all the carriages in the town were already hired, but he had got what he could, and the caballo was poco bueno, little good. He was right. It was a horse to make one's heart ache to look at, and when we stepped into the dirty old broken-down quile to which he was attached with odds and ends of old rope, the poor beast started going backwards all down the street. The driver roared profanities and clicked his lips and chucked the reins, but all to no effect, till at last he called one of our servants out of the house, and they each seized a wheel by the spokes and forced it round, so that the pony was shoved along. When it started off at a great pace, the driver sprang on the box, and we tore like the wind to the house of De la Ramos. There had been a great deal of rain, and the roads were very deep in mud, but the sky had cleared, and a bright moon was shining. In spite of this natural illumination, there was a reckless profusion of arc lights in the streets, which, as I told you, had been in black gloom for months. We had seen the lamps being repaired for some days when we went out in the evenings, and the general furbishing up and improvement extended to a sudden serving out of ice from the government factory, so that everyone was wishing there could be one of these visitations to Iloilo every week. Well, when we got to the De la Ramos house, we found all the front really extremely pretty, with huge stars and stripes flags, stripes the size of palm trunks and stars like soup plates, draped right across the front, with green palm branches stuck about, all in the light of brilliant illuminations. Great doors stood open to a vast lighted and decorated hall, with a very big cut-glass chandelier in the middle. The Poco Bueno horse was pulled up on his haunches abruptly in front of all this magnificence, and some white men leaning against the doorway picking their teeth looked at us, but offered no remark. So C, in evening dress, got out and asked one of them if this was the house where the reception was to take place. One man, keeping his toothpick in his mouth, said, "Well, I guess there is not going to be any great shakes of a reception tonight." "Oh," said C, "we got an invitation from the reception committee and heard the Manchuria had come in." "That's so, sirree," said the man, "but Secretary Taft and Miss Alice is not coming ashore. Leastways, they're on board now, eating their dinners." "Will they go to the theater, then?" we asked. "No," said the man vaguely. "I guess not. Leastways, I don't rightly know. But Secretary Taft says he don't want to come ashore before his scheduled time tomorrow morning. I reckon he's getting a bit sick of going round." The man was quite civil, but he and his fellow loungers were so vague and depressing that we drove away again, feeling rather sorry we had taken the trouble to put on evening dress. We made our driver go down the end of the street to the quay by the customs landing, where there was a very pretty arch, all lighted up, with portraits painted on it of Mr. Roosevelt and Miss Alice and Mr. Taft. This had been erected by the Filipinos, and the decorations, which were the work of a native artist, were really not at all discreditable. Across Calle Real was another arch, put up by the Chinese, at the entrance to where their shops begin, with more electric lights and pictures of angels, and more medallions of Mr. Roosevelt, with an entirely different face from the customs one, and Miss Alice, looking about 30, with fat red cheeks and masses of black hair. After admiring these marvels and noticing what could be seen of the decorations on the houses, we drove home and consoled our hearts very successfully with cold mutton, a treat from the cold storage in Manila, which would have made up to us for anything. You see, you can't have cold meat in this climate without ice to cool it on, and we have been without ice for so many wretched months. Fatty people should be sent to Iloilo to learn to say a fervid and completely heart-whole grace before cold mutton, and I often think out here of the delicious cold meat which our servants at home may be, at that very moment, refusing to eat. Next day we were awakened by a brass band walking up and down the streets, and blowing Sousa and Hiawatha for all it was worth. It was not yet dawn when this festivity began, So after we had sworn at them, we went to sleep again, for the music did not mean that anything was happening, beyond that its playing was a sort of general rouse-out and reminder. We had been informed that the reception was to be held at the Gobierno soon after the party landed. So, as we determined to bring this function to bay somehow, we sallied forth after breakfast to see what was to be seen. Aquile was not to be had for love or money, nor, indeed, a rig of any sort. So we walked to the plaza, and in the Calle Real picked up a carromata, one of the fearful little vehicles into which you climb over a muddy wheel and sit jammed up behind the driver. After sending back Sotero, who had followed to look for Aquile for us, and making him carry away Tuye, who insisted on not leaving us, we got into the carromata and drove down the crowded streets to the Gobierno. All the houses were very gay with stars and stripes and greenery, the decorations very little spoilt by the rain, and the streets full of people in clean clothes, all the principal thoroughfares crowded, but the others very empty. The day, which had begun with rain, had cleared up and was very fresh and jolly, as it had not yet had time to get steamy, and a cool breeze was blowing. The flags fluttered in the sun, bands were playing everywhere, and it was all very gay and sparkling. In one of the streets we began to pass a long procession, waiting behind the scenes, as it were, with flags unfurled and bands ready to strike up. There were crowds and crowds of people making for the palace, and we were told that the comitiva Taft had already landed and driven there, so we followed as best we could. There was a great deal of shouting of tabe, and we were as near as anything over some of the revelers who were mooning about as if the streets were deserted. By the by, I don't know whether this expression comitiva Taft is bad Spanish or good Filipino, but it is the one employed by the Philippine newspapers, and I prefer it to the American Taft Circus. When we arrived at the Gobierno, we found large crowds of little brown-faced Filipinos in white American suits, all looking up at the broad balcony, the one where the band had played on the night of the 4th of July ball. The whole expanse of balcony was full of people, with many ladies standing in front in light frocks and big flat hats. We struggled through the crowd of sightseers and into the big basement, which was decorated very profusely, and where a lot of people were standing about. A man told us he guessed the reception was going on upstairs, and we thought perhaps he had guessed correctly, so we mounted the broad stairs between sheaves of palms and American flags, and found ourselves in a huge crowd in the outer room of the suite I described to you the night of the ball. The courtroom had been arranged with rows of chairs and benches facing the dais, and the balcony beyond, with the bright blue sky and white glare of sunlight for a background, was a seething mass of white-clad humanity. I noticed the Americans were all at one end and the Filipinos at the other, an arrangement of choice, I imagine, rather than accident. Amongst the visitors I met again Mrs. Luke E. Wright and several other people whose acquaintance I had made in Manila, as the party had been nearly doubled by the numbers absorbed into it after arriving in the Philippines. My friends said they had heard I was ill and that I was going home, and envied me, calling heaven to witness that they wished they were going back home too. The governor's secretary told me that the party now amounted to 170 people, and they had a very jolly time on board and were expecting to have a very pleasant trip round the islands. There was no regular presenting being done, and no one offered to introduce us to Mr. Taft or Miss Alice, and we did not like to ask them to do so, which I am sorry about now, as I should have liked to have met them. However, Miss Alice was standing next to the governor's wife while I was talking to the latter, so I was able to get an impression of her appearance, which I thought quite pleasing. A young girl with a fluff of fair hair tied behind with a big bow of black ribbon, a very pale complexion, and heavily lidded blue eyes. She had on a coat and skirt of stiff white pique, which did not do justice to her pretty figure, and a plain straw hat with blue ribbons on it tilted over her forehead. All the American ladies amongst the visitors were very plainly dressed in shirts and skirts, as for the country in the morning, with large flat hats and floating gauze veils, just like the American tourists you see in London out of the season. The residents, however, had on pretty muslins and hats, and the Filipino ladies sported their most beautiful camisas and finest jewels. I heard afterwards that the very plain costumes of the visitors were considered as rather a poor compliment, not to say a mistake in tact, for of course the Manila papers had given glowing accounts of the lovely dresses they wore at the entertainments in Manila, and Orientals think such a lot of that sort of thing, and so do Occidentals too, for the matter of that. Mr. Taft and the senators were all in white linen suits, the officers in white linen too, plus the badges of their rank. Mr. Taft, who was a very tall, fair man of enormous build, towered over the heads of everyone about him. I don't think I ever saw anyone so vast, and could quite believe that he weighed 250 pounds, though I must say that to hear a weight expressed in pounds does not convey much impression to my mind. He has a large, clever face which creases up into an amiable smile for which he is famous, and which has helped him enormously in life. In curious contrast are his eyes, which are small and placed rather close together, and very shrewd in expression. When he is serious, it is a stern, rather hard face, and not very prepossessing, but when he smiles the Taft smile, it is altered in the most extraordinary manner, and he really looks charming. After we had been on the balcony a little time, the procession began to come into sight, headed by a brass band. At this, the people on the balcony sorted themselves out, Mr. Taft and Miss Alice standing in the front of the balcony with the chief personages behind them, and less important Americans in the doorways and on the outskirts, all in the most approved democratic style, while the brown faces all clustered at the other end of the balcony. I thought it a great pity that it did not occur to Mr. Taft or Miss Roosevelt or the governor or anyone like that to go and stand amongst the Filipinos and give a real and tangible demonstration of the theories they were there to express. I did not see anyone talking to the visitors but Americans either, and I thought that a pity too. You see, a little thing like that would convey more truth about equality than miles of bombastic print or hours of windy rhetoric. The governor's secretary found me a place in front of the balcony, but I was foolish enough to move away for a moment to speak to someone, and so lost my place. Then we saw that people were beginning to stand on the benches, so C got me a place on one by asking some men to move, which they were rather huffy about. On one side of me was a tall, thin young senator with a large hand camera, who showed his resentment in tiresome little incivilities. But the man on the other side was a nice, good-natured soul who tried to make room for me and spoke very agreeably. He seemed to be feeling the heat very much and complained that it was so fearfully hot, but I laughed and said, "This is the coolest day we have had for a long time." "My," he exclaimed, "I guess I'm not fair crazy to come and live in these old Philippines." "Oh," I said, "then you have not joined the party at Manila?" He said he had come from America all the way, and told us he was a newspaper man with a mission, come to write up the trip. This made us understand better his asking from time to time such extraordinarily elementary questions. He wanted to know what a carabo was, and was surprised to hear that sugar cane only flourished in Panay and Negros. I had to explain to him that we were in Panay, and pointed out Negros and Guimaras. I did not grudge the trouble of teaching him the ABC of the Philippines, but I could not help thinking it rather odd that he had no more preparation for his mission when his opinions would probably be voiced and quoted as oracles on his return to God's country. Of course, he was chock full of long words about the American ideal, and told me a lot about the absurdity of such narrow prejudices, race distinctions, but I let that go without remark, and without even taking the trouble to draw his attention to the demonstrations before his eyes, for I have found out by this time that you might as well talk to the wind as to a race equality American who won't sit on a car with a Negro in the States. C, who was standing behind me, joined in the conversation, whereupon the American journalist instantly whipped out his visiting card and handed it to him. But of course C was quite unprepared and had to spell his name and explain himself generally. It is very amusing, and at first rather embarrassing, the way Americans hand you a card as soon as you speak, but it has its advantages in getting names right. The procession was remarkably like the one we had seen on Declaration Day, only with different floats. I don't suppose you know what floats are, and no more did I, for when I had read descriptions of the processions in Manila and how the floats were gotten up, I concluded the function had been a water pageant on the Pasig. I heard some people about me using the same word, however, and mentioned it to my journalistic friend, who informed me that the word was one which was employed in the USA to signify cars in a procession, and that its origin was in New Orleans, where they had processions on the river with decorated floats or rafts. This was a very long procession, and some of the agricultural cars were prettily done up with banana plants, and one had sugar canes growing in it, and there were plows and rows of men carrying spades and hoes and things. Mr. Taft stood and watched it all, talking to Miss Roosevelt, but he got what the children call a good deal of powder in his spoonful of jam, in the shape of huge white banners with large inscriptions on them about the financial situation and the tariffs. Some of these reminders were of a very ingenious pattern, like huge three-sided lanterns with the inscription in English, Spanish, and Visayan, so that no one should make any mistake about what was meant. A square deal was written on one, and some of them were, to me, quite pathetic, for they said, "We are at your mercy," and others were frank, not to say abrupt, requests for liberty to govern ourselves our own way. At all these, and at the strings of laborers from the harbor works, the fire brigade, etc., Mr. Taft stared very solemnly and steadily, standing upright in front of the balcony, with Miss Roosevelt beside him, his arms folded across his chest. I was much struck by his expression and could not help looking at him as much as at the procession and wondering what he really thought of it all. When the workmen came past, our journalist friend suddenly betrayed his knowledge of Philippine affairs by saying knowingly, "Ah, these are the Chinese laborers, I guess." "No," said C., "those are Filipinos. There are no Chinese laborers in the Philippines except in some mills in Luzon." This information apparently took the man's breath away, if he believed it, which he probably did not. He was quite silent for a long time. Perhaps some of his most elaborate perorations had been damaged, and C. and I thought afterwards that it was rather a pity we had disillusioned the poor creature as we did. Another of his cherished illusions was what I may call the St. Louis Exposition idea of the Philippines, and we had the greatest difficulty in trying to persuade him that all he saw was not the direct result of the American occupation. At last the interminable lines of school children came past, all the government schools, of course, as on Declaration Day, no priests or convents. Mr. Taft had looked on unmoved and unsmiling at the agricultural and industrial displays, but when he saw these scholars, he broke into the Taft smile and clapped his hands above his head. All the Americans followed his lead by bursting into applause, which they kept up, as he did, all the time the schools were passing. I turned my head to the right, where the little brown parents of these children were crowded together, and saw that not one single Filipino made one gesture of applause. The schools took a long, long time to crawl past, and the continuous applause became rather tiring. But even a Filipino procession must come to an end if only you can wait long enough, and the last of them went past, and we got down off our bench. Then followed a great surging and shifting of all the people on the balcony, everyone trying to secure a seat in the courtroom, and we were lucky enough to get near a door and not very far from the front. On the dais were placed 2 or 3 rows of Vienna cane chairs, those for the important people in front, with arms to them. In these sat the governor, Mrs. Luke E. Wright, and Miss Alice. Next to the latter, Mr. Taft took the chair assigned to him, into which he wedged himself with infinite trouble. But the chair at once broke to pieces. Everyone laughed very much, Mr. Taft most heartily of all, saying in a good-natured, jolly way, "Here, someone give me a chair I can sit down on. I'm tired of standing." So they brought him another chair, and he took his place, and the speechifying began. The Presidente of Iloilo, a very courtly old Filipino of the name of Melisa, made a speech of welcome, a very long affair, which included the subjects of taxation, duties, and independence, to which Mr. Taft replied elusively, repeating nothing tangible but his old phrase of Philippines for the Filipinos. Then some more people made speeches, natives, and at last they drove Mr. Taft into a corner about the independence, and he said, "I am not come to give you your independence, but to study your welfare. You will have your independence when you are ready for it, which will not be in this generation, no, nor in the next, nor perhaps for 100 years or more. Even though I have told you how up to then no one had any idea of why he and his party had come to the islands, most people thinking he was going to say something definite about the Americans retiring from the islands, the natives all firmly convinced that he was coming to ratify the undated promise of independence he made them 2 years ago. Even though I have told you this, you can have no idea of the effect these words had upon the audience. We were simply staggered, and the darker complexioned amongst us sat quite still and immovable. The speeches lost some of their force by being translated as they went along by an interpreter who spoke English and Spanish with equal perfection, and indeed he was quite marvelous, but all the same the utterances lost point, and it was not easy to follow the thread with long halts between. What was more serious was that the translations of Mr. Taft's opinions were softened by the courteous Spanish phrases, and the fiery patriotism of the Filipinos was marvelously toned down in the English rendering. During a question of taxation, Mr. Taft said, "I want to know if you think it would be any good to reduce the land tax, or if, by suspending it for 3 years, the trade and agriculture of the country would benefit," or words to that effect. Whereupon he and old Senor Melisa had quite a long argument about this weighty point. The whole ceremony was indescribably free and easy, and even commonplace. Most of the senators took very little interest in the proceedings, while the ladies with them did not even pretend to care about what was going on. As to Miss Alice, she was honest enough to make no pretense at all of listening to anything, but sat staring before her, drumming with her pretty, slender white fingers on her lips, only waking up to signal and laugh to some friends in a doorway near the platform. She was very girlish and natural in this and in all her other gestures, and if she lacked the pose necessary to the occasion, one could not be too critical nor take objection to her lack of grand manner when people were presented to her, for, after all, such situations are only to be carried off with ease by those born and bred to state ceremonies. Besides, it would have been unreasonable to have looked for scrupulously aristocratic bearing amongst such a party of professed Democrats. In spite of all that, however, the Filipinos, who with their traditions of costumbres are themselves a very polite people, were much shocked by the free and easy ways of their rulers, benefactors, or whatever they are. I afterwards heard many little comments upon the American lack of dignity, which made me feel sad, for these two peoples will never understand each other, even the good sentiments of the heart being conveyed by differences of manner, which are meat to one and poison to the other. In talking of taxation, the word sugar suddenly arose, on which Mr. Taft, who was getting obviously bored and mopping his face freely, rose and said, "See here, we've come to this place to talk about sugar. Now look here, have you got any room where the gentlemen who are with me can meet your representatives? They would like to see a sugar plantation growing, too, if you can show them one." The Filipinos said they thought that could be arranged, and as a matter of fact, the hall for this confabulation was already prepared, and the growing cane ready as well. "That's all right," said Mr. Taft. "All I care about is to get out of this room and get some of that nice cool wind on me." He looked simply melting. So everyone rose up, and Mr. Taft gave out that Mrs. Carter, the wife of the general, invited the ladies of the party to luncheon with her at her house on the Calle Real at 1 o'clock. Then everyone filed away, and we went home to rest before the evening. It was then 11:30, very late for this country, and the sun very hot. I was afterwards told about the ladies' luncheon party. It only consisted of the visitors, most of whom were already personal friends of Mrs. Carter, so of course it was not an important function. Here again, I thought, was a golden opportunity wasted, for a few invitations extended to leading Filipino and Mestiza ladies would have done more good to the American cause than all the utterances of the cleverest orators. In the evening we went, in the usual pantomime quille, to the Santa Cecilia Club, where the Filipino banquet to Mr. Taft and his comitiva was to be held, or at least that was the official description of the entertainment for which, as I told you, we each paid a preposterous sum. The whole building was ablaze with lights and bunting, while the familiar perilous medley of vehicles surged about in the mud outside, with hairbreadth escapes going on every minute, any one of which would have made the fortune of a clever paragraphist. The top of the stairs, the big landing, and outer place were crowded with people, but the main room was still comparatively empty, so when we went in we had a good chance of seeing the decorations and tables. The latter were most ingeniously arranged to form the letters ILOILO, with a long table for the first I, then two long ones each with an elbow to make a sort of flat O, and then another long one with a long elbow for L, and repeat, as they say in knitting patterns. The only attempt at decoration was a mass of greenery all down the middle of each table, lying flat on the cloth, with oranges and lanzoni fruits lying on it, and salted pistachio nuts all thrown about anyhow. By each plate lay a small spray of flowers, gardenias, little roses, etc., a list of the guests, with a plan of the tables and the menu, which was a small blue paper book with a nouveau art picture of a woman on the cover. On the back of this menu was printed in large, clear type these words: La situación de Filipinas es como la de un enfermo que necesita una radical y eficaz medicación. La supresión de la tarifa Dingley es la mejor medicación para Filipinas. The interpretation of which is, the situation of the Philippines is like that of a sick person for whom a radical and efficacious remedy is necessary. The suppression of the Dingley tariff is the best medicine for the Philippines. End quote. This menu amused me a good deal, with the idea that poor, long-suffering Mr. Taft was to have politics written on everything he saw or touched, and certainly the Filipinos did not appear to be going to let slip any of this golden opportunity of voicing their grievances. The room was lighted by electric lights on the ceiling, arranged in the form of letters, spelling Taft on one side of the room and Visayas on the other, and flags, palm branches, and paper roses were employed in the usual profusion. The people dropped in gradually, and when the Taft party arrived, Mr. Taft took his place at the middle of the first L, under the picture of Washington. The rest of the party were scattered up and down the tables anyhow, with no scheme of precedence, which was very sensible and the first tangible display of democratic principles I have seen since we came to the Philippines. About 258 guests were scheduled, and less than three-quarters of the places filled. When I looked round the hall, I saw that the English and Germans were fairly well represented, but there were very few Spaniards, only about half a dozen Filipinos, some Chino mestizos, and one or two Eurasian ladies in lovely camisas and wearing magnificent diamonds. All the rest were Americans. Everyone seemed disappointed that Miss Roosevelt did not put in an appearance at the banquet. The rumor went about that she was too tired with the morning's fatigues to be able to go out again. Afterwards I heard this discussed when some said that Miss Alice was not at all strong and that the round of gaieties in Manila had worn her out, while others declared that she always shirked the serious side of the trip if she could possibly do so. But I don't expect the latter theory was true, and I thought it rather a shame of her country folk to say it. The feast began with tinned julienne, the constabulary band playing at the side in the outer room, with a vigor which quite relieved one of any necessity for conversation. I examined my list of guests and plan of the tables to find out who the people were, and saw that all the blank places were those of Filipinos. Fancy, their welcome to their patron saint. But he had so disappointed them by his avowed sentiments at the reception at the Gobierno in the morning that very few of them could be induced to come to the banquet. As far as eating went, the banquet was a haphazard affair, for it was almost impossible to persuade the dazed Filipino waiters to attend to one. At least they did attend, but in a very Filipino way, for I got 4 bottles of white wine brought me. C had never a taste of soup, and we both had 3 plates of fish put down before us, which the people on each side took away, as they could not get any at all. Everyone was very good-natured, so it was all very amusing. There was considerable liberty of conscience displayed in the costumes of the guests, some of the American men being in soiled white day suits, conducting female relations in high cotton blouses, while others were got up in full evening dress. One handsome woman, who I heard was the wife of an officer in Cape Jossman, was so much in evening dress, possibly to make up for the others in the blouses, that she was instantly nicknamed the Mermaid. Her finely shaped head was dressed very low and set off by classic bands of gold, with huge bunches of flowers and ribbons over each ear, and I heard a man near me suggest to another that someone should go and ask her to take some of the ornaments out of her coiffure and put them round her bodice. But no one had the courage to do this thing, so the little mestiza ladies stared and giggled, and as for the few Orientals present, they looked at the mermaid as if they thought equality was going to be great fun. When we were just about to fall on some beef à la mode, which had at last, after incredible pertinacity on the part of C, been placed before us, a man at one of the tables behind us suddenly got up and began to make a speech. Everyone slewed their heads round to see him and forgot the beef, which the waiters instantly fell upon and swept away beyond recall. The speechmaker proposed a health, which we drank in very good red or white wine provided for us, and then he made a speech, and someone, one of the visiting party, I think, got up and replied. After him, another got up, but many people listened to him and still held on to their helping of turkey, which they tried to eat as noiselessly as possible, a most amusing sight. Then another and another, popping up in all sorts of places, with the interpreter appearing suddenly beside them like a harlequin. Some of the speeches, in spite of the halting of the translation, were very good and very interesting, for the speakers did not mince matters much, the natives saying things very plainly, and the Americans replying with equal frankness. Next me at table sat a Filipino swell in European evening dress, with splendid diamonds on his hands and in his embroidered shirt front, who turned his chair round when the speeches began and sat astride, leaning on the back. He cleared his throat and spat on the floor in such a dreadful manner that I felt sick, and at last I turned quite faint and had to get up and move to an empty place farther on. There I was not so well off as far as hearing went, for the head of the next table was occupied by a cheery party of prominent citizens, senators and officers, who were drinking champagne and making a horrible noise. I moved again, this time to a doorway at the upper end of the hall, where a polite young mestizo offered me his chair, so I ended in being very well off as to a place, and heard and saw very well. An old senator with a venerable beard was making a long speech on the subject of freedom and the folly of race distinction. In defense of the latter theory, he rather harshly quoted Tennyson, repeating the lines about Saxon and Norman and Dane are we, which could not be applied in the remotest way to either Americans or Filipinos, and came out pure gibberish in the translation. To him replied the editor of one of the Iloilo papers, a small, full-blooded Filipino with sharp, clever features. He made a most fiery and eloquent speech, in which, with angry brown face and clenched fists thumping the back of the chair on which he leant, he declared that the Philippine Islands had been discovered as long as America, and that the Filipinos had the same spirit as that which had caused the Americans to revolt from England. He got fearfully excited, and called God to witness that his people were only asking for their rights and wishing to have this foreign burden removed. He and they demanded, insisted on, their independence. When he sat down, the waiters in the band and the Filipino spectators who had strolled in all applauded frantically. The applause, by the by, was most instructive, for the American speeches were applauded to the echo with shouts by the Americans, but the Filipinos and mestizos received the Spanish translations in utter silence. On the other hand, the brown folk roared with applause over their own speakers, and the Americans did not take the least notice of the English translations. It was a most odd and unique scene. Last of all came Mr. Taft, who spoke better, more clearly, and more simply than any of the others, and my only regret was that such a splendid delivery should have been impeded by the interpretations. He repeated all the things he had said in the morning at the Gobierno, walking even more boldly up to the independence question, and saying that the people would be given their independence when they were worthy of it, which was the sacred duty of the American people, who had received these islands as a trust from God. This was received with rapturous ovations by his countrymen, but the translation was taken in absolute and embarrassing silence, all but 2 or 3 hisses. He went on to expound the theory of educating the Filipino people up to Western ideals, and laid great stress upon the dignity and power of labor, and you must work with your hands, thunders of applause from the white men. Absolute silence after the translation. For my part, I can't say I felt much carried away by these phrases when I recollected the speaker's attitude towards manual labor and book learning a few hours before. When they were on a level with the free races, quote, in 100 years, perhaps 300, 400, they would be worthy to stand and face the nations, end quote, or something like that. He also said that he had certainly promised the Filipinos independence, and he was not going back upon his words. No, he was come to uphold, to ratify them. Dear wards from God, he called them, spreading his arms out and smiling the Taft smile, and saying, quote, that the Philippines were a solemn trust, and the Americans would not fail in this great duty towards humanity, end quote. So these fine words were all they got out of Mr. Taft, and we all rose and trooped out to find our rigs. At the top of the staircase I met a very prominent citizen, who remarked that this had been a great occasion for Iloilo, and I said, yes, Mr. Taft is a clever man and a brilliant orator. That's so, agreed my friend. He made a very fine speech. I said, he spoke a great many truths. What he said was very straightforward. Yes, said the PC, but he should have said all that 2 years ago. And that, I find, is the unanimous verdict of every class and nationality about Mr. Taft's subtle and rather tardy interpretation of the promises he made when he was governor of the Philippines. Next evening, when the party had gone and there was nothing left but to discuss what had taken place, we were leaning over the balcony when a prominent citizen of our acquaintance came walking past and stopped in the friendly, half-Spanish fashion of the country to say good evening and make a few remarks. It was a fine show, we said. Why, yes, he agreed. I guess the Filipinos did their best for the Sec War. I think he disappointed them, though, said C. Well, I should smile. I guess Secretary Taft's the best hated man in these islands now. And that, I believe, is the unfortunate truth. End of section 41. Section 42 of An Englishwoman in the Philippines by Mrs. Gambier Dauncey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ted Lienhart. Letter 42, Weighing Anchor. Hotel blank, Iloilo, August 22, 1905. We are uprooted at last, you see, out of our own delightful house and enduring the cooking and service of the best hotel this place has to afford, while we wait for the K Fong, which is reported to be loading hard wood at Cebu. This is not really such a bad place for Iloilo, which means that it compares unfavorably in comfort, cleanliness, and sanitation with a second-class commercial in a small town in Spain. However, I have a very nice big cool room opening onto a broad balcony where little trees and plants stand in tubs, and that is very agreeable to the eye, as we are right in the town and not near any gardens. There are 4 doors in this room and 6 windows, so that the room is capable of the necessary draught without which it is impossible to sleep. So far, so good, but the Filipino bed has to be reckoned with. In this case, a vast 4-poster with a very handsome piece of carving at each end. That at the head is particularly beautiful, a very free and graceful design of leaves and corn and fruit, which I wish I could take home with me. We took the precaution of bringing our own patates and pillows when we left our house, as well as our own towels, and are continually thankful that we did so. It is the chief hotel of Iloilo, as I said before, and therefore frequented by all the prominent citizens and their families, to say nothing of the military, as many of the officers board here. I think they must be such good-natured people not to make any fuss about the dirty linen and unwashed plates, or the cold and greasy food. I am afraid we are not so amiable, for we began at once to have it understood that, as we were paying the prices of a first-class hotel in London or Paris, we expected comfort and some cleanliness, and C said very definitely to our waiter that he would knock him down if he attempted again to hand things on the wrong side. This cleared the air a good deal, and when they found we insisted on having things nice, they did their best for us, and really they have made us so comfortable that we are quite patient about the Kaifong. We cleared out of our own house on Friday, this is Monday, and spent all the following day making over the furniture to the various people who came, like Joseph's brethren, bearing money in their hands. We were so sorry to see the rooms dismantled, for we loved that house and had lived in it in such comfort and so well cared for by our good servants. When C paid the latter off, he gave to each an extra present of money, which pleased them enormously, and the cook, really quite sad, said over and over again that he wished we would take him with us to England and asked to be allowed to shake hands with us, which great honor we permitted. Sotero we have brought here to wait on us, as we would not allow Filipino hotel servants into our rooms, of course. But Domingo has been paid off, though he refuses to consider himself dismissed, and I believe he is sleeping in the empty house and standing guard over our big cases, though no one is likely to run away with him, as they take about 5 coolies each to move. I begin to realize here what our openness to the monsoons meant, for I have just had to clear out of my bedroom, where I was writing, and come into the public sala, which is really a furnished corridor, because the wind shifted a little, so that it no longer blew into the bedroom. By this I mean that when the wind was off me, I burst into perspiration, my face dripping onto the paper, my hands as if I had dipped them in water, my clothes soaking, and my head beginning to ache and throb. Oh, I can't find words to express how thankful I am to be going away from this horrible, everlasting heat. It gets on one's nerves not to be able to move a chair, to walk 2 yards without dripping at every pore, and one's clothes feel so irksome and heavy. If one takes exercise, it is acute discomfort. If one does not, one is ill. We are now having the echoes of the comitiva Taft visitation, and it is really most amusing to see how the popular idol has fallen. Fallen for the Filipinos, that is, for the Americans all think him very great and cute to manage as he has done, though they are all declaring openly that he should have said all this 2 years ago, as our friend shrewdly observed to us when we were leaving the banquet. Of course, there is something to be said for Mr. Taft, for if he had made such unpopular utterances when he was governor here, his life would not have been worth 2 cents a day. All the same, to the lay mind, such subtle change of front is not very palatable, and one cannot help wishing that politicians could afford to say straight out what they mean and stick to it for good or evil. The papers from Manila with the account of our festivities have arrived, and I never read such brazen lying in my life. In fact, the reports are so cooked that they leave off being annoying and begin to be funny. The wild scenes of popular enthusiasm, the crowded banquet, the frantic love of the people of Panay for their idol, and so on and so on. And as to sheer reporting, Mr. Taft's speech, which the Manila people are informed was greeted by the natives with thunderous applause, is given at great length, but the impassioned utterances of the patriot who clutched the chair back are dismissed in a few mild words. No mention, too, of the ominous banners in the procession, of the note on the back of the menu at the banquet, and not the faintest hint of the one or two hisses which greeted the sentiments of the sequoir himself. So much for the local papers. And if that is the way they dally with truth out here, one can only faintly wonder what impression of this trip is being disseminated amongst the intelligent voters in the far-off USA by our well-informed journalistic friend and others of his kidney. The Iloilo banquet, by the by, wound up rather disastrously for American dignity, as the rowdy party at the table near us got up some quarrel with one of the Filipino waiters. There were blows and fighting, and the whole lot were chucked out into the street. This, as you may imagine, has made a horrible scandal and produced a very bad impression. About the banquet, too, it now appears that the Filipinos subscribed 70 pesos towards that and the general expenses, and the rest of the community, ourselves included, made the sum up to the 4,000 required, plus a grant from the Treasury. C went to see our poor old Spanish friend about something a day or two ago, the ex-courtier, whose visit I think I described to you, and when C said that he had not seen him at the banquet, the old fellow replied that he had sent the committee 12 pesos towards the expenses with a letter of well-wishing, etc., as he thought it was his duty to do so and to contribute what he could. Well, said C, but didn't they answer with an invitation to the banquet? No, said the old man, they did not even acknowledge the money. He seemed rather down on his luck about the whole thing, and more anxious than ever to sell his piece of land and go home to Spain to die. End of section 42. Section 43 of An Englishwoman in the Philippines by Mrs. Gambier Dauncey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ted Lienhart. Letter 43. Homeward Bound. SS Kaifong, August 25, 10 a.m. Iloilo is now far away below the horizon astern, and if I look over the side, I am afforded the delightful spectacle of one Philippine island slipping past after the other into pale blue fluff, and I hope they will stay down under my horizon forever. We scraped out through a network of taxes like fish trying to get out of a fish corral. Our 2 large cases had to get a customs permit before they could be put on board, for which they got from us a peso in the form of a stamp upon the export entry, and another peso and a half for what they call wharfage. This means that they did not examine the contents of the cases, but gave C a paper to sign and an export permit. Another item is an internal revenue tax of a peso on each passenger ticket. Fancy if we at home had to pay 10 shillings in taxes before we could go across the channel. It is so nice to be in such a clean and comfortable steamer, and to have fresh vegetables and fruit brought on ice from Hong Kong. And one wonders how the Americans can tolerate the contrast between this and those dreadful Spanish cockroach traps which they dignify by the name of the mail. All the crew are Chinese, of course, looking so straight and tall and intelligent after the stumpy, stupid little Filipinos. With them, too, as with the Filipino horses, the eye has been thrown out of focus, for the Chinese simply look colossal. I keep on thinking to myself what a very tall man that is, and he is only the usual height of ordinary men. Most of the second-class passengers are Chinese, and they have queer meals on the lower deck, all squatting round a wooden tray on which are 1 or 2 big bowls of rice and bits of meat and vegetables. Round these are piled little bowls into which the mixture is served out, and the Chinamen all set to work with chopsticks, which is so like a conjuring trick that one can watch them as long as they will go on with it. Amongst these people is a Chinaman with his Filipino wife, a little ugly woman, with her lips jutting out beyond the end of her nose, dressed in a gay camisa, and forever smoking a huge, ragged cigar. Some children of theirs cling to them most of the time, and a very gaudily dressed little chap of a more purely Filipino type, whom the Chinaman is exporting to a friend in Amoy who has bought the child for $10. You can buy children very cheaply in the Philippines, and away from the big towns, and very often in them, they are openly offered for sale, and most of the rich native and mestizo families have servants which have been bought as children. I dare say, though I have never inquired about it, that the Americans strenuously deny this officially, but unofficially it is a perfectly well-known custom. This small slave was a very native little chap of 3 or 4, got up in purple cotton coat and a crimson jockey cap, and radiantly happy in his new clothes, and we could not really feel very sorry for him. The Chinamen all take the greatest care of their hair, combing it out every day, and some of them have magnificent glossy black locks right down to their knees, but others, whose hair is thin and scanty, eke out their pigtails with long cords of black silk gimp. Talking of servants, when we came down to the Muelle Loney, to think I shall never see that place again, this morning we found Domingo waiting, in his smartest clothes, spotlessly white, and his skin shining with soap, to see us off. Poor fellow, he hung round, blubbering quietly, and carrying anything he could catch hold of, and when he said goodbye his face was quite pathetic. I think he felt he was losing the only people in the world who had ever treated him well, and he was one of the best specimens of a typical unspoilt Filipino, stolid, obedient, humble, and faithful as a dog, and C said he would have given anything to have been able to take him with us, as the poor creature implored us to do. At the last, when the launch was pushing off, Domingo made a wild rush to spring on board, but was too late, and the last we saw of him was standing on the quay with his hat off and the tears streaming down his big brown face. We discussed this rush of Domingo's, but can arrive at no satisfactory solution of what he wanted to do, for I think he only wanted to come out to the Kaifong, but C says he is certain he meant to follow us to Hong Kong and compel us to take him with us. Well, we can't do that, but we have done our best for him in making him from a rough coolie into a clean, smart servant who can get double the wages he received from us, and we found him a good place before we left, though, as I said before, I am not at all sure how either he or the other will do with the impatience and curses with which the average white man thinks he impresses his dignity upon the colored person. It is not to be done in the Anglo-Indian method, no, nor in the American extreme of familiarity. Of that I was persuaded before I came here, and am still more convinced now that I have more experience. The only way to impress anyone, black, brown, or white, with the idea of your dignity is to be dignified yourself. But I suppose this is too much of an obvious truism for anyone to attempt to think over or act up to. Well, it served me in very good stead, and all I know is that though every soul I spoke to had endless complaints about the impudence, laziness, or dishonesty of their servants, whether they were of the nation who kicked them or those who allowed them to wear a vest in the house and not say "Señor," we never had any trouble once we got rid of our first Americanized cook. My house went as on oiled axles, and we never missed one single thing from start to finish. So what am I to say of the Filipinos? Those with whom I came in contact, as well as my own servants, were a narrow, cunning, good-humored people, vain, superstitious, stupid, great gamblers, kind to their children, and bitterly cruel to animals. Oh, the poor hens hung up by the heels in the sun, and the wretched pigs with their 4 feet lashed together that used to lie all day scorching in the plaza at Molo. The awful open sores under the harness of the starving ponies. The brutal, sickening cockfighting. For those horrors alone, I should be thankful to leave this country, even were it the paradise which it is not. No, no terrestrial paradise, for one has the laziness, the heat, the apathy, and cruelty of the East, without the compensations of artistic beauty, cheapness, plenty, and luxury, which make up for those drawbacks in other hot countries. A shuffling, drab, discontented, thick-headed, costly East, with all the worst traditions of 400 years of the offscourings of the Spanish monkish orders, overlaid by a veneer of shallow cocksureness hastily assimilated from a totally incongruous alien civilization. We carry a cargo of sugar, and from the ventilators come up gusts of that peculiar, heavy, nauseous odor which carries one back instantly to the Camarines of Iloilo. I can't believe that the Philippines are really a thing of the past for me. It is not that I was there so long, but there was so little variety, and we saw and did and heard the same things so often that I am left with an impression of as many years as we have been there months. End of section 43. End of An Englishwoman in the Philippines by Mrs. Gambier Dauncey.